Hello there, and welcome to the planet's memory, where we let the world unfold slowly, like a tide returning to shore, and where wonder is not hurried, but held gently in the hands of time. If you're listening right now, maybe you've been looking for a little stillness. Maybe the noise of the day has finally faded, and your body is sinking softly into rest. Let this be a quiet place where the earth can whisper, and you can simply listen. Tonight, we begin with a question. Not a loud one, but the kind that lingers just behind your thoughts, like the afterglow of a dream or the soft pull of memory. What if Earth, once upon a time, became so still, so empty, that not even the sound of breath remained? What if this planet, nearly forgot how to live? It's hard to imagine a world without motion, without birdsong or wind, without the rush of rivers or the hum of insects beneath bark. And yet, there may have been a moment, long ago, when life fell so quiet that the earth became almost sterile. Not because of violence, not because of sudden collapse, but because of something slower, something quieter, something that slipped through the cracks of deep time. You see, extinction doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it unfolds over thousands, even millions of years, like ink spreading slowly through water. And during one such time, known to geologists as the Permian-Triassic extinction event, up to 96% of all marine species vanished. Gone. Vanished into silence. Imagine that. A world once teeming with coral, trilobites, strange spiraled shells. Emptied. Not all at once, but in a slow, suffocating hush. We trace this stillness not in bones, but in absence. In the spaces between things. In the gaps where fossils should be, and in the quiet change of chemical signatures hidden in ancient stone. Carbon isotopes in the rock layers tell us the air itself was poisoned. The seas, once alive, turned to acidic basins. Oxygen plummeted, heat rose, and life, as it had once been, began to fold inward. But how does a planet forget how to live? That's the question we sit with tonight. Because Earth has always danced a delicate rhythm between thriving and vanishing, between bloom and decay. And there was a time, this time, when the balance tipped too far. Geologists studying the Siberian traps believe massive volcanic eruptions may have triggered this event. For nearly 1 million years, lava poured across what is now northern Asia. Ash, carbon dioxide, sulfur. The sky darkened, the oceans warmed, and the great engines of the biosphere began to stall. Rain cycles broke, food chains crumbled, plankton died, and with them the breath of the sea. The silence began there, microscopic, invisible, but it spread. And maybe that's the most haunting part, that it didn't take something large to begin the end. Just a change in chemistry, a slight rise in heat, a ripple in balance. It began small. It began soft, like all things that matter. We weren't there, of course. There were no humans yet. No minds to name the silence or record the loss. But Earth was still listening. The crust, the mantle, the slow churn of plate tectonics. They carried the memory forward. Carved into rock. Layered into canyons. Locked in clay. The planet remembered. Not in words. Not in story. But in pressure and entropy. In the geometry of erasure, and we now are the ones reading it back. There is something beautiful about that, isn't there? That even in ruin, Earth wrote things down. Not with intention, but with consequence. Every layer a page, every fossil a whisper, every isotope a breath held too long. And so we wonder, how close did it come? How close was this world to ending entirely? To slipping into permanent silence? Could it be that just a few microbial pockets, deep beneath the seafloor or trapped in thermal vents, kept the memory of life alive? Maybe, maybe not. But the possibility is humbling, because it reminds us how fragile this balance is, how thin the thread of survival, and how silence isn't just the absence of sound, but sometimes the echo of what was. You might be wondering, lying there now, what this silence felt like. Not just scientifically, but sensorially. What color was the sky when the air thickened with carbon? What did the sea look like without fish, without movement, without light? Did the trees, if any remained, sensed the stillness too? Did the rocks sigh beneath the heat? We'll never know. Not exactly, but we can imagine. And in that imagining, we draw closer to something ancient, something forgotten, something worth remembering. Because when Earth almost died, it didn't scream. It simply stopped growing. It paused. It waited. And in that waiting, time held its breath. We don't tell this story to alarm. We tell it because it's part of us. Because the memory of extinction is also the memory of survival. And because, somehow, in ways we don't fully understand, life began again. But even as it did, something was lost. A chapter erased. An entire branch of life that may never return. And that question remains, like a quiet knock in the back of the mind. If this much could be lost, what else might we have forgotten? And yet, if this much can be lost, what else might we have forgotten? Let us drift now, slowly, gently, into the water. Not the water we know. Not the bright blue sea that calls to swimmers and tides. But an older ocean. A deeper one. The kind that existed before whales ever sang. Before fish had bones. Before life had even learned how to arrange itself in delicate symmetry. We drift into the late Permian. Roughly 252 million years ago. A time that feels like a dream within a dream. So distant it humbles even the most ancient forest. These oceans did not glisten with promise. They darkened, thickened, quieted. Something subtle was slipping out of place. It began at the molecular level. Carbon levels rose, oxygen dropped. Bacteria, once thriving in balance, began to dominate the chemistry of decay. The seas warmed slightly, then more. And with every degree, the deep became more silent. The balance that sustained oceanic life had tilted. Too much carbon dioxide bled into the atmosphere from vast volcanic outpourings. The sky thickened. The oceans absorbed the burden, and their chemistry began to shift. Waters once rich in life became low in oxygen, and what oxygen remained vanished into deeper layers. Without it, most marine organisms simply couldn't breathe. But there was more. As the oceans stagnated, sulfide-producing bacteria, ancient, invisible, relentless, flourished. These microbes fed on the dying and, in return, released hydrogen sulfide gas. Toxic, corrosive, and bitter. Slowly, the oceans filled with it. Not as a sudden flood, but as a quiet, suffocating tide. Hydrogen sulfide is invisible. You cannot see it, but it leaves fingerprints on stone. And it kills without warning. As it seeped upward through the water columns, it created what scientists call euxinic conditions, a beautiful word for something so bleak. Waters that were not just low in oxygen, but actively poisonous. Not a sea, but a dissolving. Imagine looking into those waters now, if one could. The surface still, almost glassy, but below, silence. Layers of rotting detritus, marine snow that never stops falling, sinking into depths that no longer support life. Everything slows. Everything dissolves. Even time feels heavier here. What must it have been like for the creatures that lived through this? Ammonoids drifting through the currents, their soft shells curling like delicate scrolls, feeling something shift in the currents. Trilobites already fading, vanishing completely by the end of it all. Coral reefs, entire cities of color and complexity, bleaching, breaking, disappearing into sludge. Species that had survived dozens of climate swings and extinction pulses gone. Not in flame, not in flood, but in chemistry. The sediment tells us the story, patiently. It records a thick black line in marine cores, dark shale full of organic remains, preserved in the absence of oxygen. Dead zones. No fish, no shells, just carbon-rich mud. The Earth wrote this chapter in ink too dense to fade. And perhaps this is why we call it poison glass. Not just because the ocean turned lethal, but because it preserved things so clearly. As though the moment of dying became frozen. Beautiful in a quiet and terrible way. Glass can reflect, after all. And if we lean close enough to this ancient sea, maybe we catch a glimpse of ourselves. Maybe we see the fragility of balance. Maybe we feel the thinness of the thread. Maybe we remember that our own breath comes still from ocean plankton, from the same drifting miracles that once gasped in these waters. And yet, even in this dark time, some forms endured. Deep within the sediments, microbial life retreated and adapted. Tiny pockets of resistance, survival in stillness, memory embedded not in minds, but in enzymes and membranes. It was not triumph, but it was not extinction either, not completely, and that too lingers in the rock. A record not only of dying, but of almost surviving. The ocean did not remain poisoned forever. Slowly, very slowly, the chemistry shifted. Volcanoes cooled. Carbon levels dropped. Photosynthetic life returned to the shallows. And the cycle turned again. But the earth never fully forgot. Cannot. That memory is baked into every reef, every basin, every whisper of oxygen in the sea. The silence of the Permian Ocean still echoes. And we, even now, breathe its lesson. A lesson without anger, without judgment, just memory, just reflection. And as we surface from those ancient waters, we look around and wonder, if the ocean can forget itself, dissolve into something so unrecognizable, what other parts of Earth have done the same? We turn now slowly toward the land. But not the scattered continents we know today. Not the maps we've memorized. We drift back through shifting plates and unmeasured time, to a place where everything was still and everything was one. Pangaea, a word that sounds like myth but is not. A name carved from Greek, meaning all earth. One vast landmass, stitched together by tectonic will, resting in silence beneath a burning sun. For a brief moment in the planet's long exhale, nearly all dry land was connected. No ocean separated east from west. No rift divided north from south. Just one colossal continent, sprawled across the equator, breathing slowly in the heat. But something about that breath was fading. Pangaea was not a garden. It was not Eden. It was a place of extremes. Its interior, far from any ocean, lay parched and dry. Without moisture carried inland by wind or sea, rain became rare. Rivers shrank. Deserts spread. Winds scoured the dust from the bones of mountains. And beneath the soil, roots reached down, but often found nothing. It is hard to imagine what the center of Pangaea felt like. No shorelines, no tides, no moderating breezes. Just sun, just heat, just stillness. An inland so vast that climate could not circulate. The land held its breath for too long. And yet, even in this dryness, life clung on. Forests skirted the coasts. Reptiles emerged in strange new forms. Seeds began to drift on the wind. But something else was unfolding beneath the surface. Geologists believe that the interior of Pangaea became a trap for carbon. Without much rain to weather rocks, the great geochemical cycles that remove carbon dioxide from the air, slow, steady, essential, began to falter. Volcanic carbon built up in the skies. The greenhouse thickened. The world began to warm, and Pangaea, already brittle with drought, grew hotter still. The air shimmered. The soil cracked. Lakes evaporated. And with them, the memory of balance dissolved. From high above, had any eyes been watching, Pangaea might have seemed like a sleeping giant. But it was not asleep. It was unraveling. Slowly, quietly, inwardly. And then, in places along its fractured spine, the earth began to split. The crust, always restless, started pulling apart at the seams. Mantle plumes swelled upward. The surface cracked open like overbaked clay. And from these cracks came lava, rivers of it. Basalt floods poured over the land, baking forests, filling valleys, and releasing gases into the sky that would alter everything. This was not a singular explosion. It was a slow-motion transformation. A geologic breath that took hundreds of thousands of years to fully exhale. And as it did, it sent sulfur into the skies and carbon into the seas. The land, once merely dry, now became dangerous. Some scientists believe this prolonged volcanism, part of the vast formation we now call the Siberian Traps, was the spark that lit the Great Dying. It was not just what the oceans became, but what the supercontinent had already set in motion. the drought, the heat, the carbon, the breathless center of the world. And this raises a quiet question, doesn't it? Can a land forget to breathe? Can something as massive as a continent hold its breath for so long that it chokes itself slowly? The idea feels strange. But Earth does not think like us. It moves differently. It responds in rhythms too large for our minds to hold. And sometimes, in its silence, it begins to lose balance. The fossils tell part of the story. Ferns vanishing, amphibians retreating, insects shrinking in size. Not all at once, but gradually, as if the world were dimming one species at a time. The land's memory faded into layers of sandstone and silt, and beneath them, coal beds record forests that never returned. There is no monument to Pangaea. No cliffside carving or boundary line that tells you where it began or where it ended. It exists now only in the scars it left behind, in the jagged coastlines of continents that used to fit together like puzzle pieces, and in the fault lines that still pull them apart. But what if more than land was forgotten? What if a way of living, a planetary balance, was lost during this time? The breath of Pangaea may not have been a literal breath, but it shaped climate, atmosphere, evolution itself. And when it broke apart, the Earth changed direction. Not forward, not backward, just elsewhere. So we ask again, softly this time, what else might we have forgotten? Not just in oceans or rocks, but in the shape of the world itself. Because sometimes even the largest things leave the faintest traces. And sometimes the stillest places are the ones where the most was lost. And if a landmass as vast as Pangaea could vanish without a sound, what else has disappeared simply by being too large, too slow, too quiet to remember? What else has disappeared simply by being too large, too slow, too quiet to remember? Maybe fire. Not the flicker of a candle or the crackle of a hearth, but something deeper, older, planetary. The kind of fire that doesn't dance, but devours. The kind that doesn't spark from match or friction, but from the Earth's own hunger to change. We are drawn now to one of those ancient hungers, buried in stone, stitched into the crust like a scar, where the land once opened wide and poured itself out. The Siberian traps. Even the name carries weight. A place not of one volcano, but of many. Not a single event, but a sequence. A symphony of eruptions that lasted not hours or days, but hundreds of thousands of years. The Earth didn't explode. It bled. The ground tore open across what is now northern Russia, and basalt spilled like black rivers across the land. Lava sheets stacked atop lava sheets, thick enough to bury mountains. Ash rose into the sky like breath from the lungs of the world, and everything around it, forests, lakes, soil, life, turned to shadow. This wasn't the kind of fire that could be seen from one mountaintop. It covered millions of square kilometers. It filled the air with sulfur and dust. It heated the oceans, choked the sky, and rewrote the atmosphere. And in doing so, it may have rewritten the fate of life itself. Some scientists believe this was the true spark, the trigger, the quiet catastrophe that unspooled almost everything. But how does fire in the crust become death in the sea? It begins, as so many endings do, with gas. As the magma rose through the crust, it met layers of carbon-rich rock, coal beds, organic shale, ancient remains compressed over eons. When lava touched these layers, they didn't just burn. They transformed, released, breathed out carbon dioxide and methane in volumes the planet hadn't known in millions of years. The sky thickened. The oceans warmed. The planet's breath, once slow and balanced, grew fast and fevered. Temperatures rose by degrees that don't sound large, until you realize how fragile ecosystems really are. A few degrees is enough to change everything. And then came the sulfur. Volcanoes do not only release warmth, they also release shadow. Sulfur aerosols, flung high into the stratosphere, reflected sunlight back into space. The skies dimmed. The planet, paradoxically, cooled, even as the greenhouse below intensified. A climate in contradiction. Heat below, cold above. Pressure. Chaos. Rain became acidic. Soils withered. Photosynthesis faltered. And oxygen, already fragile in the sea, began to vanish even from the air. We do not have footage of this time. No records written in human hand. But we have the rocks. We have the layers. We have the charcoal embedded in fossil beds. Proof that forests burned. That lightning struck. That things once living became ash. And perhaps that's the part we forget. Fire does not only destroy. It leaves behind a story. An ash, though weightless, carries memory. Imagine standing beneath that sky. Dark in midday. The sun a dull red eye behind veils of sulfur and soot. The horizon blurred. The air thick, quiet, almost still. No birds. No insects. Just the distant groan of the earth reshaping itself. Fire below, ash above. Breath, suspended. And yet, life tried. Even in the shadow of eruption, mosses crept back. Microbes evolved. Tiny ecosystems found shelter in cracks and hollows. The planet was changing, yes, but it had not yet given up. Not entirely. Still, something had shifted permanently. The isotopic record, those quiet ratios of carbon and oxygen left behind in rock, tell us that the Earth's carbon cycle entered a kind of spiral. A loop that fed itself. Warmth created decay. Decay released carbon. Carbon created more warmth. A feedback loop not of machines but of geology and time. Entropy is often seen as the end. But sometimes it's just a different order. A rearrangement. And perhaps this fire, this long, slow burn, was not just an erasure, but a reconfiguration. Not a final act, but an intermission. Still, we ask ourselves, did the Earth mean to do this? Of course not. The Earth does not mean. It moves. It shifts. It balances and unbalances. And sometimes, in doing so, it brushes close to silence. Close enough that life forgets how to begin again. But it always does, doesn't it? Eventually. Even after the fire. Even after the sky turned black. Because what erupts eventually settles. What burns eventually cools. And what turns to ash sometimes, somehow, becomes soil again. But the question lingers in the soot and shadow. If this much can unravel from deep within the earth, what else might lie sleeping beneath our feet, waiting to breathe? We turn now to that moment, the moment when the unraveling became silence. When breath faded not just from the land or the sea, but from the very rhythm of life itself. The great dying. A name we've given to something too large to name. A phrase that tries to hold in its syllables what words were never built to carry. Because this wasn't just an extinction. It was nearly everything. Nearly everyone. Roughly 252 million years ago, in the span of a geological blink, the planet hovered near absolute biological collapse. 96% of marine species vanished. 70% of land vertebrates gone. Even insects so ancient, so enduring, faltered. It was not a meteor, not a single event, but a sequence, a slide, a slow disappearance written in ash and carbon and time. A planetary suffocation that unfolded over tens of thousands of years, or maybe less. The details blur. The silence does not. There was a point, quiet, still, irreversible, when the curve of life dipped so low that recovery felt improbable. A threshold crossed, where Earth, for a flicker of deep time, stood on the edge of sterility. Imagine it now. The oceans, once echoing with ancient songs. Trilobites drifting, coral waving, fish gliding through thick blue light, reduced to zones of stasis. Anoxic, toxic, lifeless depths. Water too warm to hold oxygen. Too acidic to nourish shells. Too still to stir. Entire ecosystems blinked out. Not in fire, not in frost, but in the absence of breath. And above the sea, the land fared no better. Forests turned to ash. Swamps dried into deserts. Amphibians, whose moist skins once pulsed with Earth's humidity, collapsed into extinction. Reptiles wandered across cracked soils under a sky both too dim and too hot. And everywhere there was space. Space where life had been. Space that would take millions of years to refill. But in the moment, it must have felt like a breath held too long. A pause in the planet's own remembering. Entropy surged. Not in chaos, but in stillness. The systems that kept life in balance, climate, chemistry, carbon, water, had slipped out of sync. Oxygen could not circulate. Food webs could not form. The biosphere fractured, not with sound, but with absence. And here, in the heart of this extinction, we ask, was there a moment, a single trembling moment, when Earth nearly became a sterile sphere drifting in cold space? Could that have happened? Could the balance have tipped just slightly further and left the planet quiet forever? Maybe, maybe not. Science gives us clues. It shows us the numbers, the loss, the recovery lag. It shows us the fingerprints of disaster in rocks from every continent. The same thin, dark band of sediment laced with pyrite and soot and isotopes out of place. But science can't show us how that moment felt. Not to a fish, gasping in waters turned sour. Not to a tree, standing alone in air that no longer knew rain. Not to the earth itself, trembling beneath a sky layered with ash. Still, we try to imagine. Because in imagining, we remember. And in remembering, we feel something larger than loss. We feel the gravity of survival. Because something did endure. Not much. Not loudly. But enough. Tiny burrowing creatures. Bacteria clinging to thermal vents. Spores hidden in the shadows. The smallest, most adaptable forms of life, the ones we often overlook, were the ones that carried forward the memory of being alive. And so, Earth did not die. Came close. But it did not. Instead, it held that moment, that hour of quiet, and folded it into its memory. We can still see it. Not just in fossils, but in the scars etched across the geologic record. A pause. A void. A hush between layers. A quiet space between two worlds, the one that came before, and the one that had to begin again. It's easy, sometimes, to look at extinction as a kind of ending. But maybe it's more like forgetting. A forgetting so deep, so complete, that even the air seems to lose its pattern. The wind doesn't know where to blow. The clouds don't know how to fall. The soil forgets how to grow. And when that happens, when all the rhythms are broken, what remains? Silence. Not the peaceful kind. Not the kind we long for at the end of the day. But the hollow kind. The vast, suspended kind. The kind that reminds us how rare life truly is. And yet, from that silence, the earth began again. Slowly. Clumsily. With mistakes and mutations. With failures and restarts. But it did begin. And the life that emerged afterward. The strange reptiles, the seeded plants, the soft whispers of early mammals, carried something new. Not just resilience, but memory, a cellular echo of what it means to nearly vanish, and still return. And that, perhaps, is the truest lesson of the great dying. That even in the quietest hour, there is a whisper, a pulse, a tremor that says, not yet, not entirely, but it leaves us wondering, if life could slip so close to the edge once, what keeps it from happening again? And in that question, open, quiet, waiting, we drift into the next unfolding. But it leaves us wondering, if life could slip so close to the edge once, what keeps it from happening again? To begin answering that, we don't look to bones or ruins or ancient coastlines. We look to the shadows that life leaves behind, not in shape, but in chemistry. Invisible fingerprints coded in ratios, etched into stone by the atmosphere itself. The memory of air, trapped inside Earth. Carbon isotopes. These tiny whispers are how the planet remembers what it once breathed. All around the world, across layers of ancient sediment and petrified ocean floors, geologists have found strange signatures, disruptions in the delicate balance between two forms of carbon. Carbon-12 and carbon-13. It's a quiet difference, nearly imperceptible. But it tells a story more haunting than any fossil ever could. Because when ecosystems are healthy, these isotopes flow in a kind of dance, balanced by photosynthesis, decay, and respiration. Plants and microbes take in carbon-12 more readily than carbon-13. The oceans absorb and release in rhythm. The air, the land, the sea, all keep time together, like a planetary breath. But during the Great Dying, something broke that rhythm. Suddenly, there was too much carbon-12. A flood of it. Anomalies appear in rock after rock, from China to Greenland to South Africa, all showing the same sharp drop in carbon-13 levels. It was as if the Earth exhaled something vast and ancient all at once, and the atmosphere choked on its own memory. Where did it come from? Perhaps from the combustion of buried carbon. Coal seems ignited by lava flows. Perhaps from thawing methane hydrates at the bottom of the sea, released as the oceans warmed. Or from microbial blooms in stagnant waters, producing gases too fast for life to absorb. Maybe it was all of these at once. A chorus of disruptions, a domino of feedbacks, and suddenly, the Earth found itself drowning in the very thing that once fed its forests. Too much carbon, too fast, too sustained. The atmosphere, thickened with CO2 and methane, turned hostile. The oceans, already low on oxygen, could no longer regulate the load. The land dried, the rain turned acidic, and carbon, once the backbone of biology, became its undoing. But even as this catastrophe unfolded, the isotopes kept recording. Quietly, faithfully, they left behind what scientists now call a carbon isotope excursion. A global signal, preserved in limestone and shale, marking the deepest breath Earth has ever taken and nearly never exhaled. And this is where the idea of planetary memory begins to feel less like poetry and more like physics. Because the Earth does remember, just not in the way we do. It remembers in ratios, in trace elements, in chemical alignments so precise they require no language, only time. And in that memory, we find echoes not just of extinction, but of change, of tipping points crossed, of balance lost, of the way life and air are stitched so closely together that one cannot unravel without tugging the other loose. And maybe that's the most unsettling part, because carbon is not rare, it's not foreign, it's what we are made of, what we eat, what we breathe. It is the architecture of trees and shells and cells. It is the ink of life. But in the wrong place, or the wrong amount, it becomes shadow. And once those shadows are cast, they do not fade quickly. They linger, in stone, in ice, in coral, and now in us. Because the same carbon we measure in ancient rocks is the carbon we burn today. The same ratios, the same gases, the same atmosphere, only warmer, thicker, more anxious. And so we ask, not in fear but in quiet reflection, are we beginning to write a new carbon shadow? A new echo, layered not in limestone, but in steel and soot and silence? Maybe, maybe not. But the Earth will remember either way. It always does. And so, as we press our ear to the ground and listen to these isotopic rhythms, we don't just hear collapse. We hear calibration, the slow accounting of imbalance, the record of air, of breath, of forgotten equilibrium. And in those quiet ratios, we are reminded that the atmosphere is not separate from us. It is not above us. It is in us. We are part of the record now, part of the layer. And if carbon is the pen the Earth writes with, what are we asking it to remember next? Maybe we're not asking at all. Maybe memory isn't something we offer the Earth, but something the Earth leaves behind, in pieces, in pressures, in patterns that don't resemble thought, but still feel like knowing. And maybe that knowing is never neat, because the Earth remembers in fragments, in the slow disordering of once-ordered systems, in the quiet unraveling of layered complexity into simpler forms, in the drift not toward chaos, but toward calm, toward stillness, toward equilibrium, toward entropy. We think of entropy as decay, as loss, as the enemy of structure. But here, in the deep archives of Earth, entropy is something gentler, a soft settling, a dissolution, the way ash finds the lowest corner of a room, the way energy once spent simply fades. And it is in the sediments that entropy leaves its clearest trace, layer upon layer, mud becoming memory, silt becoming signal, each sheet of stone a slow, graceful surrender of order to time. What looks like a flat plane of rock is, in truth, a story of descent. Minerals falling from water, organic matter folding into mud, the remains of plankton, pollen, volcanic ash, dust from vanished mountains, all drifting downward, all finding rest. Disorder, reorganized. Entropy doesn't scream in the record. It whispers, says, "This was once complex. Now it is quiet." Says, "This was once alive. Now it is still." And yet, even in stillness, patterns emerge. Repetitions, echoes, rhythms that resemble thought. A band of dark shale here, rich in carbon, laid down when life perished and oxygen vanished. A thin ribbon of iridium there, the fingerprint of an ancient impact, foreign dust settling into silence. An alternating sequence of limestone and marl, waves of rising and falling seas, rising and falling breath. All of it disorder slowly taking shape. All of it entropy woven into strata. And if we zoom out, far out, we begin to see the earth not as a surface but as a scroll. A sedimentary archive of forgetting. Each extinction a blackout. Each warming pulse a blur. Each collapse a smudge. Yet somehow these smudges still hold meaning. They tell us not what happened in moments, but what happened in tendencies. In tendencies toward stasis, toward simplicity, toward the lowest energy state, because that's what entropy really is. Not destruction, but the quiet equalization of difference, the erosion of edges, the slow undoing of what once stood apart. And so we wonder, can disorder leave an organized trace? The answer lies beneath our feet. Every cliff face, every canyon wall, every slice of core drilled from the seafloor. They are organized traces of disorder. They are entropy crystallized. And we read them backwards, from the newest at the top to the oldest buried deep. That inversion is strange, isn't it? To learn about the past, we must dig into the most forgotten places. To find the future, we often only need to wait and watch things fall. In this way, sediment is like memory itself. Not perfect, not precise, but persistent. And in its persistence, it teaches us something fragile. What once seemed permanent always settles. Even mountains become dust. Even oceans turn to stone. Even ecosystems, with all their branching intricacy, become bands of dull gray rock. Not because they didn't matter, but because everything, given enough time, chooses rest. Even complexity seeks stillness. Eventually, and maybe that's not a tragedy. Maybe that's simply how the planet breathes. It builds, it bursts, it balances, and then it settles. The entropy we find in sediment is not the end of the story. It's the pause between stories, the quiet space between chapters, the blank line in a poem where meaning rests before unfolding again. And as we stand among the cliffs and cuttings, reading these ancient silences, we realize we are part of the sediment, too. We walk on layers built from forgotten weather, extinct forests, dissolved cities of coral. We breathe air filtered through systems shaped by entropy, through cycles of collapse and recovery. And one day, we too will become part of the record. Our metals, our plastics, our isotopes, our absence. Will they read clearly or blur into noise? Will our entropy resemble a memory or a mistake? We cannot know. But we do know this. The sediments are always watching, always folding time into texture, always pressing history into patience. And so we listen, not for answers, but for patterns. Because if disorder can leave a trace, what else might the earth be keeping track of, just beneath the dust? Could it be us? Or not us exactly? Not this version, but some other, one that came before. One that built and imagined and reached, and then disappeared. Sounds like fiction, a bedtime thought, the kind of musing that arrives late at night when the world is quiet and the mind, half asleep, begins to wander. But it's also a question rooted in science, in sediment, in signal, in what we choose to see or forget. If a past intelligence once rose and fell, would we recognize its residue? Or would entropy erase even its ghost? We are used to finding civilizations in stone, in pottery, in carvings, in ruined cities overtaken by vines. But these are recent, barely a blink in Earth's chronology. The last 10,000 years, a whisper across the surface. But what if something came before that? Much, much before? 1 million years ago? 10 million? Even longer? That's the scale the Earth remembers. And that's where the idea of technofossils begins. A technofossil is not a bone or a leaf. It is the signature of technology embedded in the geologic record. Not the object itself, but the trace, the residue, the change it left behind. Think of concrete, aluminum, plastics, nuclear isotopes, carbon composites, rare earth elements arranged in unlikely ratios. These are things the Earth does not make on its own. Not in these forms, not in these concentrations. They are distinctly unnatural. And in our own time, they are everywhere. A layer of synthetic material, light, durable, resistant to decay, already lines our oceans, our rivers, our soils. It clings to the feathers of birds. It is pressed into glaciers. It drifts through the upper atmosphere. We are, without meaning to, inscribing a new stratum in the stone. The Anthropocene, some call it. The age of human impact. But what if we are not the first to do so? What if, long before us, some other intelligence lived, not for centuries but for epochs, long enough to rise slowly, spread widely, and leave behind traces too subtle for us to recognize? Not pyramids, not satellites, but carbon, or disruptions in oxygen flow, or strange isotopic excursions like the ones we puzzle over from the Permian. Maybe we've already seen their shadows and mistook them for natural. Because time doesn't preserve all things equally. Steel rusts, wood rots, cities fall and are buried. Even our most advanced machines, given enough time, will return to dust. The deeper you go in the geologic record, the less likely it is to find form, only pattern, only residue. And in residue there is room for doubt. Take, for instance, the Silurian hypothesis, a real scientific proposal that asks whether an industrial civilization could have existed millions of years ago, and whether we'd even know. Not because it did, but because we cannot fully rule it out. That's the strange thing about deep time. It hides both truth and possibility in the same layer. And entropy is always cleaning up. Not with purpose, not with cruelty, but with patience. Over enough time, all evidence blurs. All meaning dissolves. And what's left behind may look, to us, like a natural anomaly. A spike in carbon. A thin line of ash. A sudden disappearance of species. And so we are left to wonder, not just about the past, but about ourselves. What will we leave behind? What will the Earth remember of us? Not our photos, not our stories, but our chemicals, our waste, our rearrangements of metal and mineral. Will those layers tell a story of civilization? Or will they seem, to whatever comes next, like a sudden disruption, followed by silence? That may be the most haunting echo of all. Because if we are not the first, then history is not a straight line but a loop. A wave that rises and falls over and over in different forms with different names. And each time the planet endures, but forgets. Each time the memory fades into pressure, heat, and time. So maybe that's why we dig. Why we ask. Why we keep reading the rocks, not just for fossils but for patterns that don't belong. We're not only looking for the past. We're listening for resonance, for recognition, for that strange, breathless moment when we see ourselves reflected in something impossibly old. A mirror in the mud, a whisper beneath the stone, a trace of minds that may have once asked the same questions, built the same dreams, made the same mistakes, and disappeared, not with a bang, but a long exhale. And if that's possible, if even intelligence can vanish so completely that it becomes indistinguishable from geology, then what, truly, does it mean to be remembered? Maybe we've been searching in the wrong places, not in books, not in myths, but beneath our feet, where the ground folds in silence, and the past doesn't tell stories, it becomes them. Because stones remember. They do not remember as we do. There are no names etched inside them, no emotion, no faces. But in their layers, in their pressure, in their tilt, in the way they fracture and bend, they hold the shapes of time. Not years, not even centuries, but stretches of history so vast they no longer feel like history at all. In canyons and cliffs, in road cuts and quarry walls, Rocks open like books we were never taught how to read. Folded strata, rippled lines, bands of iron, seams of fossil, each one a sentence, pressed into place by unimaginable weight and time. Each one holding the memory of something that once moved, once breathed, once was part of the sunlit world, now quiet. A ripple in shale may seem like nothing, but it once cradled the shadow of a current, the movement of a shallow sea, a rhythm in water stilled into permanence. A jagged line in granite might look like an imperfection, but it's the record of tectonic strain, of mountains rising and falling like slow breaths, of continents remembering where they came from, and sometimes, rarely but not never, we find something even deeper. The curled remains of an ammonite, fossilized mid-spiral. The impression of ferns in stone now buried a mile beneath forest. A trilobite crushed between silt and silence. They are not simply relics. They are memories trapped in compression. Geologists call it the rock record. But it's more than record. It's narrative. A stratified memory, shaped by erosion and heat, by floods and volcanoes and rain. Events written not in words but in matter. The death of a forest, recorded in coal. A drought in cracked mud turned to stone. A comet's impact in a thin line of iridium. Even the absence of something can be a kind of memory. A missing fossil, a vanished layer, a sudden shift in mineralogy. These are the silences in Earth's story, the places where something was and is no longer. And though we like to believe memory fades, the truth is, rocks forget slowly. Compared to us, they almost never forget at all. Our lifespans are measured in decades. Stone measures in epochs. What we call ancient, they call recent. What we call permanent, they have seen undone again and again. And still they remember. Not with clarity, perhaps. Not with purpose. But with gravity. With patience. Even a small pebble holds memory. Of fire if it is volcanic. Of ice if it has been carried by glacier. Of pressure if it was buried deep and surfaced again. Even now, it holds the scars of all the things it has touched. And so we wonder, how much of Earth's past have we stepped over without seeing? How many stories lie hidden in plain sight? How many truths are buried, not far below, but just beneath the reach of our imagination? Rocks do not speak, but they listen, they endure, they wait. And when we learn how to read them, slowly, gently, they begin to show us how deep the memory of this world really goes. Not because they want to be known, but because they simply are. And in that quiet persistence, we begin to remember too. We begin to sense time not as something linear, but layered. Not as a line, but a depth. Not as progress, but as pattern. And when we finally press our hand to stone, when we trace its seams with our fingertips, it feels less like touching the past, and more like brushing against a mirror held perfectly still. Because in the memory of rocks, we begin to hear the memory of ourselves. But what if, for a time, even that memory hesitated? What if there was a moment when the planet, so full of breath and motion, stopped? Not forever, not with finality, but just paused. A breath held, a rhythm skipped, a long planetary exhale with no inhale to follow. Not everything changes with violence. Sometimes, the most unsettling transformations are the ones that do not arrive at all. A system built on flow begins to slow. Winds weaken, currents stall, rain forgets how to fall, and time itself begins to stretch not forward, but outward, like a surface with nothing pressing against it. This is not a fantasy. It's a pattern we've seen quietly, subtly in Earth's deep past. Periods where climate systems stalled. When the great conveyor belts of ocean water stopped circulating. When monsoons failed. When ice held in place longer than it should. When heat pooled in one hemisphere and refused to move. These are not guesses. They are recorded in ice cores and pollen deposits, in isotopic drift and fossil droughts. And each time, life had to wait, because when the planet stops moving, everything listens. Wind, once a sculptor of dunes and pollinator of flowers, falls still. Trees stand in heavy air. Clouds form but do not break. Rivers dry into dust. and even sound seems uncertain. We call it climatic inertia, the tendency of large systems to resist change. But in deep time, that resistance can become something else. A stretch of centuries, even millennia, where nothing really shifts. The earth alive but resting. This pause is not peace. It is imbalance wearing the mask of calm. Because life needs movement. It needs cycles, rotation, contrast, the conversation between hot and cold, wet and dry. Without it, ecosystems falter. Feedback loops stall. Growth becomes impossible. Evolution waits in silence. And so, we ask gently, what happens to a world that waits too long? In some extinction events, we find evidence of stalling before the collapse. Before the pulse of loss, a murmur of stillness, a thinning of clouds, a flattening of seasonal difference. And then, after long hesitation, the system tips. Into fire, into flood, into cold, or heat, or something else entirely. But in that pause, there is something poetic. Something ghost-like. A kind of suspended time, where geology records no great event. Just the absence of change. Imagine it. You walk across a plain. The grasses do not bend. The air does not move. The sun rises, but its path feels too slow. Days stretch longer than they should. Nights do not cool. And in the soil, roots pull nothing. Seeds remain sealed. Everything waits. Not out of fear, but because the cues are missing. Even deep ocean currents, which usually spiral and swirl with thermal grace, may at times have gone quiet. No upwelling. No churn. No nutrients rising from the abyss. Just layers of water stacked in silence. A forgotten ocean, where everything settles but nothing is reborn. This has happened, and it could happen again. We live on a planet that is both dynamic and delicate. Systems that seem vast, the jet stream, the Gulf Stream, the monsoon, can falter under the right pressures. Add enough heat, melt enough ice, shift the salinity of the sea, tilt the balance, just slightly, and movement stops. Not permanently, but long enough for memory to lose its anchor, long enough for ecosystems to forget how to adapt, long enough that the world becomes unfamiliar, not because of what's been added, but because of what's no longer there. Motion. This is the stillness that doesn't soothe. It hovers. It holds. It waits. And in waiting, it becomes its own kind of pressure. Because the longer the pause, the more fragile the next movement becomes. When the winds do return, they may not return gently. When the rains do fall, they may fall too hard. When the heat does shift, it may shift too far. And so we are left with the image of a world not in chaos, but in suspension. Not broken, not healed, just hovering. A blue planet adrift in its own inertia. And the question rises quietly, from the space between seasons. If Earth can pause like this, how long can it wait before it begins forgetting how to move again? Perhaps the answer lies not in the surface, where weather stutters and ecosystems blink out. Perhaps it lies deeper, far beneath the pause, beneath the silence, beneath the breathless crust, where movement never really stops. Because even when the world above seems still, something far below is always ticking. Slowly, quietly, relentlessly. Geologic time. It doesn't tick like our clocks. It has no hours, no hands, no face. But it keeps rhythm all the same. A pulse of heat, a beat of pressure, a slow churn of minerals realigning in the dark. Down here, beneath the crust, even extinction seems small. Mass die-offs, lost atmospheres, collapsed forests. All are recorded as passing weather to the deep interior. For the mantle, which moves in currents that take millions of years to complete a single cycle, surface history is just a momentary ripple. And yet, the story of life is shaped by that rhythm. Tectonic plates, drifting on the mantle's slow breath, reshape continents. They push mountains into the sky and drag ocean floors into the fire. They open rifts. They close seas. They bury memory, and sometimes lift it again. Even when the biosphere above nearly vanished, during the Great Dying, during global freezes, during long silences, the plates kept moving. The clocks kept turning. Not with urgency, not with mercy, just with gravity, just with time. One kind of clock lives in zircon, a tiny, ancient mineral that can trap uranium atoms inside its lattice. As uranium decays, it becomes lead. The ratio between the two becomes a timestamp, a crystalline archive. Some zircons are over 4 billion years old, older than the moon's oceans, older than Earth's first breathable sky. They do not remember what was living, but they remember what was forming. Other clocks measure isotopic decay in rubidium, potassium, samarium. Some track helium trapped in cooling magma. Some read the slow resetting of atomic alignment in rocks exposed to sunlight. Each method, each clock, counts something different, but together, they whisper the same truth. The Earth has never stopped keeping time, even in its darkest hours, even when no light touched the surface, and no breath stirred the sea. Even when silence seemed total, the clocks ticked on. We don't always know what they were timing, only that they were. And somehow that's enough. It means that below the memory of extinction lies the memory of endurance. That below the noise of surface catastrophe, the planet held a deeper rhythm, slow, grounded, imperturbable. It means Earth never forgot how to move. Not really. The mantle still convected. The core still spun. The heat still rose. Radioactive decay still warmed the rocks. Even in absolute surface stillness, no rain, no growth, no flight, these inner motions continued. And maybe, just maybe, this is what pulled life back from the edge. Not a miracle, but momentum, a deep geological inertia. Steady, subtle, nudging the surface back into motion. Circulating heat, releasing gases, opening new seafloor, recycling crust, making way for new beginnings. It's strange to think that something so lifeless could be the reason life began again. But maybe life doesn't require reassurance. Maybe it only needs the clock to keep turning. And it did. In darkness, in pressure, in the forgotten zones where stone forgets it was ever soft. There's something comforting about that, isn't there? That even when the biosphere seems fragile, the geosphere remains vast. That beneath every extinction, the Earth was already preparing for something else. Not planning, not guiding, just continuing. And so we walk unknowingly on clocks too slow for us to hear. We live in the echo of their ticking. Every continent we know, every mountain range, every fertile valley, is the result of these slow turns. And long after we're gone, they will continue. Unbothered, unchanged. The surface will shift. Oceans will come and go. Species will rise and vanish. But the clocks beneath the crust will still be ticking, still marking time in magma and crystal, in heat and pressure. And one day, far from now, they may bring the surface back to balance again. Because time never truly freezes. It only slows. It only waits. And when it begins to move again, we might not even notice, until the world changes once more. The change doesn't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it returns in color, soft at first, hesitant, as if life itself is testing the silence before singing again. We begin to see it in the coral. Not the coral we know today, not yet, but in the ancient reefs that once cradled entire worlds. Shallow marine shelves where sunlight kissed the seafloor, and life unfolded in quiet, intricate rhythms. For hundreds of millions of years, coral reefs were the great architectures of biology. They built without tools, engineered without minds. They wove skeletons from calcium, constructed cathedrals from chemistry. And in their halls swam the earliest fish, the earliest symmetries, the earliest ecologies. But after the great dying, even these bastions of life collapsed. The warmth, the acidity, the lack of oxygen, it was too much. Reefs bleached before the term existed. Coral polyps, once luminous, expelled their symbiotic algae in desperation, turning translucent, then pale, then absent. And for a time, the seafloor was skeletal. The cradles of the ocean turned to bone. There were no gardens of anemone, no swaying forests of soft coral, no darting fish or flickering crustaceans, just frameworks abandoned, slowly dissolving in water no longer fit to build. But even in that quiet, something small began to stir. Not loudly, not confidently, but with the persistence that defines all survival. Tiny reef builders, cousins of coral, or ancestors of something new, began to take root in isolated pockets. Microbial mats stabilized soft sediment. Sponge-like organisms reappeared. Algae, resilient and ancient, began to photosynthesize again in the warming shallows. They weren't building reefs yet. Not really. But they were whispering to the sea, "We remember." And the sea slowly began to respond. New reef systems appeared not where the old ones had been, but in strange, displaced places. Different chemistry, different species, different forms. They weren't recreations. They were echoes. And yet the shape was familiar. The instinct to gather, to layer, to reach toward the light while anchoring in the dark. This was something deep, deeper than coral itself. A pattern written into the blueprint of marine life. Build, shelter, host, repeat. Took millions of years. Not decades, not centuries, but layer by layer calcium returned to the seas. Oceans, once murky with death, began to clear. Waters circulated again. Oxygen returned to the upper layers. And in that breath coral returned. Not the same species, not the same reefs, but the same desire to build, to become, to hold life. It's strange to think of coral as desire. But what else can we call this slow, luminous reaching? They don't move. They don't think. And yet, they create entire universes of motion around them. Currents bend around their bodies. Fish evolve to match their labyrinths. Colors bloom because coral gives space for light to linger. And so they became cradles again. Echoes of the original ones, but no less sacred. Fossil reefs from this post-extinction era show new architectures, different forms of branching, different organisms playing old roles. Even now, scientists are unsure where the line is between recovery and reinvention, between return and rebirth. And maybe that's the most hopeful truth of all, that life doesn't always need to remember its exact shape. It only needs to remember how to begin. The coral did. And in doing so, it became one of Earth's most faithful timekeepers. A geologic diary written in rings and ridges, in mineral and memory. Even today, coral records the world in its bones. Every year it grows just slightly. The bands in its skeleton reflect changes in temperature, in chemistry, in nutrient flow. Storms leave marks. So do droughts. So does pollution. Coral doesn't forget, it incorporates. It becomes what the world gives it. And yet, it keeps building. We often think of stone as the memory of the earth. But perhaps coral is the emotion. Because to build beauty in stillness, to hold life in fragility, to shine in water that has forgotten light, this is something like love. Or at least something like persistence. And so we look to the reefs even now for answers. Not because they are perfect, but because they are stubborn. Because they remember extinction and survived. Because they carry the echo of what nearly ended, and made something new from it. And in that echo, we might hear a quiet question ripple through the currents. If coral can begin again, what else might be waiting to rebuild, just beneath the surface? Maybe dust. Not the kind we wipe from shelves or see floating in sunbeams, but the deeper kind, the older kind, the kind that carries the fingerprints of extinction and the quiet outlines of creation. Because in the end, everything becomes dust. Mountains collapse into it. Bones crumble into it. Civilizations, when time has had its say, leave behind no monuments louder than silt. Dust is the final word spoken by stone, the soft whisper of matter undoing itself. It is not loud. It is not fast. But it is always present. When we look at extinction not as a sudden vanishing, but as a process of disassembly, of complexity returning to simplicity, we begin to see dust not as debris, but as memory. The memory of form, the memory of motion, the memory of things that once held together. It is carried by wind, by water, by breath. It settles on coral, on glaciers, on the backs of beetles. It drifts from volcanoes, from deserts, from stars. A single grain might travel across continents, through atmospheres, across oceans. Each particle a quiet archive of something no longer here. And that makes dust a kind of storyteller. A quiet one, patient one. Tells us that nothing truly disappears. It only changes its arrangement. It loosens. It softens. It begins again in smaller pieces. In ancient sedimentary rock, we find layers rich in fine-grained dust, laid down during moments when the world seemed to slow. After extinction, after collapse, these are not chaotic layers. They are calm, even, almost gentle. They suggest that after life falters, dust continues. Not in resistance, but in rhythm. Even now, our own atmosphere carries dust from long-lost worlds. Saharan dust feeds the Amazon rainforest. Glacial dust falls into Antarctic snow. Volcanic dust circles the globe years after eruption, telling the sky what it remembers. And deeper still, inside meteorites, inside moon rocks, inside the oldest stones ever touched by human hands, we find cosmic dust. Stardust. Pre-solar particles that predate our sun. They are impossibly small, but they hold isotopic signatures that tell of supernovae, of ancient stellar deaths. Even stars become dust. And so, perhaps, this is the truest memory of extinction. Not a monument, not a fossil, but a grain. And yet, dust is not just a residue. It's also a beginning, because wherever dust gathers, new stories can form. In the early solar system, it was dust that clumped together, that gathered mass, that began to orbit and collide and accrete, until planets formed, until moons formed, until Earth itself began to take shape from swirling fragments of broken things. And on Earth, dust gives birth again and again. It seeds clouds, it feeds soil, it carries minerals to barren lands. It softens the edge between life and lifelessness. Some of the richest ecosystems begin with dust. And when life dies, it returns to dust, not as an end, but as an offering. A return to potential, a quiet reset. And so we walk upon it every day. We breathe it. We stir it with our steps. We wipe it from our windows, unaware that in its particles are the remnants of ancient forests, distant mountains, volcanic ash, pollen, bone, salt, and star. We are surrounded by the afterlives of things. And if we listen closely, dust reminds us that every ending leaves something behind. Something small, something scattered, but something real. We may not remember the creature. We may not know the name of the place or the age of the stone. But in the grain, in the mineral pattern, in the residue of erosion, in the elements suspended in air, there is a continuity, a soft-spoken inheritance. Dust is grief made gentle, decay made useful, extinction made breathable, and it asks a quiet question of us. What are we leaving behind in the dust we're becoming? Not in mourning, but in motion, because if everything breaks down to dust, then everything also begins there, in silence, in stillness, in the soft potential of scattered things ready to be rearranged. Because if everything breaks down to dust, then everything also begins there. But what about what doesn't begin again? What about the parts of history that simply stop? Not with transition, not with rebirth, but with disappearance. What happens when not even dust remains? Can silence fossilize? Not the silence of night or space or solitude, but the deeper kind. The kind that follows collapse. The kind that settles into place when life has nothing left to say. A silence so complete it becomes sediment. That's what some layers in the Earth's crust suggest. Not a story of what happened, but a story of what didn't. Not a record of thriving, but of absence. There are places in the rock record where life should be and isn't. No shells, no spores, no bones or teeth or trace burrows. Just smooth, dark shale, uniform, fine-grained, deceptively quiet. These are not accidents. They are silences you can touch. In certain cores taken from the ocean floor, entire intervals exist where biodiversity flatlined. No radiolarians, no foraminifera, no plankton with their glassy structures, only carbon-rich sediment, thin, dark, compressed, a hush pressed into stone. We call these black shales, and they're found across time during the Great Dying, the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, oceanic anoxic events. They do not speak of life. They speak of stagnation, of waters without oxygen, of atmospheres thick with poison, of moments when Earth simply stopped its conversation with biology. And yet, these layers are some of the most legible, because silence, when uninterrupted, becomes a kind of clarity. There's no noise, no clutter, just a long, uninterrupted exhale of stillness. When we look at a fossil bed rich with trilobites or ammonites, we see life captured in a moment. But when we look at an anoxic shale, we see time itself, suspended, undisturbed, monotonous. Not because nothing happened, but because nothing could. It is this very stillness that allows the memory to survive. Silence fossilizes not in what it shows, but in what it denies. No coral fanprints, no ripple marks, no burrowing trails in the mud. Only sameness, only sorrow, only the weight of what was once possible, and then wasn't. But perhaps this kind of fossil is even more revealing, because what we often seek in the rock record is evidence of life. But what if absence tells us just as much? What if extinction leaves a stronger impression than existence? Think of it this way. A thriving world leaves behind countless fragments, scattered and competing. But a collapsed world leaves behind unity, simplicity, the same gray powder, the same sulfuric stain, the same carbon haze, over miles and miles and miles. And that monotony becomes loud. It becomes undeniable. It becomes a silence that echoes forward. There's a term in geology, hiatus, a gap in deposition, a break in the record. Sometimes it means erosion. Sometimes it means stillness. And sometimes it means something happened, but left no mark. Silence once again. But even that nothingness can become something. Even the absence can accumulate. Even the void can turn to stone. There is a deep poetry in that, because it reminds us that time never stops, even when life does. And in the spaces where nothing is preserved, we are forced to listen harder, to ask better questions, to wonder, what kind of world made this silence possible? Was it heat, cold, acid, slowness? Was it that no life lived, or that no life could survive long enough to leave its trace? And how do we tell the difference? Sometimes the only clues are chemical. Tiny variations in sulfur isotopes. An absence of bioturbation, the churn of burrowing creatures. A flattening of elemental diversity. The Earth doesn't just record noise. It records the pause between notes. And those pauses matter. They give shape to the melody. They remind us that for every burst of evolution, there was a moment of waiting. For every explosion of life, a long, dark stretch of recovery. And for every beginning, an ending so complete it leaves behind nothing but tone. Maybe this is why silence unsettles us. Not because it means nothing happened, but because it means something did and then stopped. It's in these gaps that we see ourselves most clearly. Because we, too, fear being forgotten. We build. We write. We speak. We try to outpace entropy with monuments and memory. But what if our most lasting trace is not what we make, but the shape we leave behind when we're no longer here? What if silence is the most honest fossil of all? Not a record of what we did, but a measure of how long it took the world to fill the space we left behind. And if that's true, then silence isn't just absence. It's aftermath. It's transition. It's a bridge between worlds. And when we press our hand to a layer of stone that holds no life, no pattern, no sound, we're not just touching history. We're touching the breath the planet held between lives. And when that breath was finally released, it didn't come with thunder. It came with cells. Tiny ones. Simple ones. Unseen and easily dismissed unless you knew where to look. Unless you understood that while complexity perished, simplicity endured. The microbes stayed. They did not build monuments or fossilize like bones. But they were there, waiting in sediments, clinging to rocks, thriving in darkness, surviving in acid, feeding on what little was left. And in that waiting, they were not passive. They were busy recalibrating the chemistry of the world one molecule at a time. Because when the higher forms fell, the fish, the forests, the architects of bone and breath, It was the bacteria who rewrote the script. They had done it before. They had seen worse. Microbes were Earth's first architects, after all. Long before mass extinctions, long before bones, they had already shaped oceans, skies, and continents. It was microbial life that filled the atmosphere with oxygen over 2 billion years ago, not as intention but as consequence. And so when extinction struck, when complexity collapsed and Earth stood bare, it wasn't an end for them. It was a reset, a return to the beginning, and maybe a quiet opportunity. In hydrothermal vents and anoxic muds, in salty shallows and deep fractures in the crust, microbes formed webs of resilience. They didn't need sunlight. They didn't need oxygen. They needed only gradients, energy imbalances, and a substrate to live on. They became the threads that stitched the biosphere back together. Cyanobacteria once again began to photosynthesize, releasing oxygen molecule by molecule. Sulfate-reducing bacteria transformed toxic environments. Methanogens and archaea re-established balance in the deeper zones. They were not rebuilding the old world. They were composing a new one. This time, the scaffolding came from the bottom up. And slowly, delicately, the world responded. Atmospheric oxygen, once dangerously low, began to rise again. Nutrient cycles restarted. The oceans, no longer stagnant, stirred back to motion. And in that motion came possibility. It would be tens of millions of years before large animals returned. Even longer before ecosystems regained their former intricacy. But the foundation, invisible, microbial, persistent, was already in place. And this invites a quiet thought. Were microbes the true authors of Earth's second chance? Not by design, not with intention, but through persistence. Through sheer continuity. They never stopped. They adapted where others couldn't. They traded genes. They shared resistance. They formed biofilms and communities more ancient, more cooperative, more quietly intelligent than anything we've built. We often look at the history of life as a ladder, simple at the bottom, complex at the top. But what if that's wrong? What if complexity is just an occasional flourish? What if the base, the microbial world, is the real story? Not primitive, not basic, but enduring. Because microbes are not just survivors of extinction. They are the memory of life itself. Unbroken, unshaken. In every layer of the rock record, we find their traces. In stromatolites, in isotopic signatures, in the tiniest grains of ancient clay. Even now, more than half the biomass on Earth is microbial. They live in our oceans, in our soil, in our bodies. They digest what we cannot. They breathe for us. They balance our systems. They shape our evolution not visibly but fundamentally. They were here before us. They will be here after. And in that quiet resilience, there is a kind of authorship. Not of narrative, but of continuity. When the planet became nearly sterile, microbes were not the ending. They were the pause that became the prologue. A pause filled with slow transformations. A breath filled with soft persistence. A stillness filled with ancient memory, encoded not in language but in structure, in coiled strands of genetic possibility. And maybe this is what it means to be an architect at the scale of planets. Not to design, not to control, but to hold the pieces long enough for something else to begin again. To keep the blueprint folded in protein. To keep the chemistry alive. To keep the silence from becoming permanent. And so, in the deep layers of stone, beneath the fossils, beneath the fractures, beneath even the quiet of extinction, the microbes endured. And their work, invisible, patient, gave Earth back its voice. But a voice, once lost, does not return unchanged. There are always words it can no longer remember. There are always stories it forgets how to tell. And so we wonder, in that long planetary silence, what was forgotten? When ecosystems unraveled and biologies blinked out, what possibilities vanished with them? What potential lives never lived? We often speak of what went extinct, species named and numbered, habitats mapped in hindsight. But extinction is not just the end of what was. It is the erasure of what could have been. Every lineage that vanished carried with it 1,000 futures. a reptile that might have flown, a fern that might have flowered, a symbiosis that never formed, a path not taken, not because it failed, but because time simply ran out. The earth does not mourn these absences, but it bears them, in gaps between fossil layers, in sudden absences in diversity curves, in quiet, empty spaces where form and function should have unfolded and didn't. This is planetary amnesia, not the forgetting of one species, but the forgetting of entire experiments in being. It is a forgetting so complete that we cannot even reconstruct what was lost. There are no records of the species that never evolved, no fossils of the anatomies that never formed, no clues left by the intelligences that never learned to shape tools or thought. Only silence, only questions. What ideas never emerged in neural networks that never had the chance to assemble? What colors were never seen by eyes that never opened? What songs were never sung by creatures that never took a breath? The sediment holds the memory of what was, but it cannot hold the shape of what almost was. Those stories are unspoken, not hidden, just never formed. And so we are left, standing in the shallows of deep time, staring into the murk of all that Earth has forgotten. Perhaps this is why extinction feels so final. Not because it ends life, but because it ends memory before it begins. Each loss is a closed door in a hallway we'll never walk. And yet, some of these doors might have led to wonders. Not miracles, not myths, just possibilities. Quiet ones. A biosphere where insects became the dominant engineers of stone and sky. An ocean where cephalopods rose to civilization, curling their futures in spirals of soft intelligence. A forest ruled by something unrecognizable. Not mammal, not bird, not mind as we know it, but something else entirely. Something we'll never name. Because the earth, in forgetting, does not leave behind shadows. It leaves behind emptiness. Even mass extinctions, with all their violence, are not loud in the rock record. They are most often measured by what's missing. By the break. By the gap. A breath held too long. And when life resumes, it is not a continuation. It is a restart. Not a rebuilding of the old world, but the forging of a new one, shaped as much by what is no longer present as by what remains. And perhaps that is the most haunting part of planetary amnesia, that the new is built on absence, that the shape of the future is determined by the gaps in the past. We speak often of evolution as progress, as ascent, but it is also reaction. It moves not toward a goal but away from erasure. It adapts not to fulfill potential, but to survive the forgetting. And so, we carry that forgetting within us. Our DNA is the result of bottlenecks, of edits made by silence. We are not the sum of all life's possibilities. We are the thread that remained, after so many others frayed and fell. Even our imagination is shaped by the memories we never inherited. We dream with the minds that made it through, and what we cannot picture may be what the earth once knew, and then let slip. So we listen not only for the fossils, not only for the echoes, but for the quiet space between them, the long pauses, the blank lines, the forgotten songs, because somewhere in that stillness is the shape of a world that might have been. Not a lesser world, not a better one, just other, just lost. And as we drift deeper into the planet's memory, we ask ourselves, softly, what would it feel like to remember what Earth has forgotten? Maybe it would feel like breath, just at the edge of absence. Because there was a time when even air began to vanish. Not all at once, not with a gasp, but with a long, drawn-out exhale the planet didn't know how to reverse. A quiet depletion. A slipping of something so elemental, so invisible, that most life didn't know it was dying until it had already begun to fade. We call it oxygen, but to the world that almost lost it, it was life itself. Oxygen was not always here. It arrived slowly, billions of years ago, sculpted from light and water by the simplest forms. Cyanobacteria drifting in shallow seas, exhaling oxygen as waste. The planet, at first, didn't know what to do with it. Rocks absorbed it greedily. Oceans drank it down. It took eons before the atmosphere accepted this new presence. But once it did, everything changed. Complexity flourished. Animals emerged. Cells with mitochondria, engines that burned oxygen for energy, rewrote the story of evolution. Breath became the foundation. With it came movement, nerve, awareness. Inhale, exhale, a rhythm older than language. And then, during the Great Dying, that rhythm almost stopped. As volcanic eruptions filled the sky with ash and the oceans with carbon, oxygen levels began to fall. Slowly, persistently, both in the water and in the air above it. Marine life was the first to feel it. The oceans grew warm, stagnant, thick with hydrogen sulfide. Oxygen, once dissolved in water and passed through gills in delicate exchange, became scarce. The deep turned toxic. Even the shallows became dangerous. Fish suffocated in silence. Corals gasped and collapsed. Plankton died, and with them the very engines of atmospheric renewal began to stall. And on land, the air thinned. Not visibly, not dramatically, but measurably. The oxygen in the atmosphere dropped to levels unknown in the history of complex life. Some estimates suggest it fell below 15, maybe lower. For comparison, today we live in 21. Inhaling deeply now is something we take for granted. Then, it became effort, and with effort came limits. Lungs struggled, metabolism slowed. Giant insects, once sustained by high oxygen air, vanished. Reptiles, cold-blooded and slow, replaced the fast and the delicate. Even the forests changed. Fires burned differently. Photosynthesis faltered. The world dimmed, and breath became rare, almost mythical. Perhaps, in that silence, there were moments when the wind carried the last oxygen to a high ridge or shallow sea, and something there, small and ancient, drew in a final breath it didn't know would be its last. Oxygen didn't just feed life. It shaped it, and its absence shaped it too, because those who survived did so not by thriving, but by enduring scarcity, by adapting to low-oxygen environments, by shrinking, by slowing, by waiting. In Earth's great geochemical records, we can trace this loss. Ratios of sulfur and carbon isotopes tell the story. Sediments laid down in oxygen-deprived seas. Black shales rich in organic matter, never decomposed, because the bacteria that needed oxygen to break it down could no longer function. Even the rocks breathed differently. And perhaps this is what makes oxygen so strange, so sacred. It is everywhere and yet so easily lost. It is invisible, and yet it sculpts everything. And when it goes missing, the world doesn't explode. It fades. A little less color, a little less motion, a long pause between breaths. And yet, even as levels fell, even as the world tilted towards silence, something held on. Photosynthetic organisms, battered but persistent, kept working. The sky eventually began to clear. Volcanoes quieted. The carbon cycle shifted. And over tens of millions of years, oxygen began to rise again. Slowly, then steadily. Life inhaled and remembered, but not all the way, because even now, oxygen holds the memory of its fragility. It fluctuates. It depends. Can vanish again. And in parts of the world today, in certain seas and lakes, we still see echoes of that ancient breathlessness. Dead zones where no oxygen lingers and no life moves. The potential for silence is always present. And so we wonder, what if oxygen had not returned? What if breath had remained scarce? A relic, a memory, a chemical myth spoken only in the cells of bacteria clinging to vents in the dark. Would another form of life have emerged? Would memory itself be possible without breath? Or would the planet have drifted forward in geological time, alone? A world that once exhaled and then forgot how. We cannot know, but we can feel it. Every breath we take carries that ancient tension. The gift of oxygen is not permanent. It is conditional. It is a balance, held by ocean plankton and forest canopy, by soil bacteria and algae drifting beneath the ice. And every time we breathe, we participate in that balance. We inhale the history of the earth. We exhale into its future. And in the stillness between breaths, we remember, there was a time when the air itself was almost lost. And in that thinning breath, the record thinned too. Because not everything that lived left a trace. Some bodies, soft or strong, ancient or brief, dissolved so completely that they left nothing behind. No tooth, no scale, no vertebra to press into stone. Only questions, only silence. We often imagine extinction in shapes. Skeletons in rock, jaws frozen open, imprints of wings or leaves or claws. We look for bones and build stories around what we find. But in many places, in many ages, there are none. Just layers of mineral, untouched. Smooth, clean, quiet. And we ask, what vanished here without a sound? Did heat erase them? Did acid turn them to vapor? Did time forget before memory could form? Because fossilization is not the rule, it is the exception. For a bone to survive, it must escape decay, scavenging, dissolution. It must be buried quickly, entombed in the right sediments, sealed from oxygen and movement. It must resist erosion, compression, and the chemistry of deep time. Most bones don't get that chance, especially during cataclysms. The Permian-Triassic extinction was not just a loss of species, it was a loss of conditions. The very environments that preserve life were undone. Soils became acidic, waters turned corrosive, heat accelerated decay. In many regions, even mineralized tissue, enamel, calcium, phosphate, could not withstand what came. And so entire ecosystems vanished without a trace. No fossils, no impressions, not even a chemical ghost, just a stratum where life should be, and isn't. Some call these ghost intervals, periods where we know life must have existed, because evolution did not stop and extinction was not total, but where the rocks say nothing. They are blackouts in the planet's memory, and they unsettle us, because they remind us how easily the record can disappear, how fragile even the hardest parts of life really are. A femur, a rib, a tooth, things we think of as permanent, can dissolve in days if the conditions are wrong. And during Earth's darkest hours, the conditions were often very wrong. Rain that fell like vinegar, soil that burned the roots it touched, temperatures that turned flesh to vapor before it could cool. Even the oceans, those ancient preservers of history, became agents of forgetting, thick with hydrogen sulfide, stratified, acidified, incapable of keeping the dead. And so, the bones were gone, before they could settle, before they could fossilize, before they could whisper anything into stone. And yet, we know they were there, not because we see them, but because we don't, because something should be in the layers and isn't, a gap where creatures once moved, a space where bodies once belonged. It's a strange kind of evidence, the evidence of absence, a negative imprint, a hole in the continuity of life. And it forces us to wonder, how much have we already lost? How many forms of life, whole lineages, entire biologies, have come and gone without leaving even a bone behind? What color were their eyes? How did they move? What songs did they make in the air or sea or soil? We'll never know. And perhaps that's the most humbling thing of all, that not every story becomes a fossil. Not every existence is remembered by stone. The earth forgets too, not out of carelessness, not with intent, but because forgetting is part of how the planet moves on. It layers over itself. It melts. It folds. It erases to make room. And in that erasure, something poetic emerges. A reminder that permanence is an illusion. Even the hardest parts of us, bones, teeth, shells, can vanish like breath in hot wind. And yet, even in these ghost layers, there are whispers, a rare trace element, a subtle shift in isotopic ratios, a sudden drop in biodiversity measured not by presence, but by its opposite. The world speaks in patterns, not portraits. And sometimes the missing is as meaningful as the found. So we listen, not just for fossils but for the spaces between them, not just for skeletons but for the seams of stillness where something lived, and then did not. And maybe, just maybe, in that quiet, we begin to hear what the bones themselves could not say, that not every story needs to be seen to be real, that some lives are held, not in stone, but in silence. and some silences press so lightly into the rock that they're almost missed. A whisper, not a wound. A film of clay. A shift in color. A line so fine you could brush your hand across it and feel nothing. No ridge, no crack, no scar. Just a pause. And yet, that pause holds everything. Because some extinction layers are thin. Almost invisible. Barely there. But when you find them and you learn how to listen, you realize, these are ghosts. Geological ghosts. They haunt not with shape or sound, but with absence that still manages to leave a mark. A millimeter of gray ash. A smear of iridium. A subtle collapse in the diversity of microfossils. A quiet shift in isotopes that says, something changed here. Something ended. But what? The ghosts don't say. They never do. They linger between certainties. Not gone. Not fully present. But enough. Enough to make a geologist pause in mid-cut through a core sample. Enough to ripple through data, to unsettle baselines, to raise soft questions that have no hard answers. They are not like the dramatic layers, the ones where bones pile in heaps, where lava hardens over forests, where craters speak with clarity. These ghosts are delicate, polite. They don't interrupt. They simply wait. And they leave just enough behind to make you wonder. A thin clay seam in Italy marks the end of the Cretaceous, a whisper of the impact that ended the age of dinosaurs. Elsewhere, the same clay appears in Denmark, in New Zealand, in Texas. Always thin, always quiet, planetary veil, ghost layers. Not thick enough to crush, just enough to remember. Some are even thinner, less than a grain wide. The residue of a slow dying, a drawn-out collapse rather than a sudden fall. Organisms vanish from the fossil record, not in a blaze, but as a soft fade. One fewer species in each layer. One less kind of shell. Pattern slowly unraveling. It's hard to point to any one moment. But the ghost is there, haunting the strata, because rocks remember in layers, not lines. And the deeper you look, the more you begin to see that every extinction has its own shape. Some scream, some exhale. Some vanish so gently that it takes a century of science just to hear them whisper. And that, too, is a kind of art. The art of geological ghosts is not in what they show. It's in how they suggest. They bend time. They ask questions with no punctuation. They invite you to imagine what was just before, and what came just after. And in that imagining, something stirs. Because we, too, are layered beings. We carry ghost moments. Quiet ruptures, soft disappearances, that don't scar, but shift us, that change our inner landscape in ways almost no one sees. A breath missed, a conversation that never happened, a silence too deep to name. The earth feels that too, and it stores those moments in its stone. Subtle, vast, almost unnoticeable, but permanent. A ghost is not proof. It is not data. It is suggestion. And yet it reshapes how we read everything else. Just like these layers, the ones that haunt the rock not with noise, but with the gentle trace of forgetting. And so we ask, what haunts the strata? Not monsters, not myths, but memory itself. Memory that's faded, but not gone. Memory that left just enough behind to remind us. Something was here, and it isn't anymore. But the chemistry remembers. Even when the bones dissolve, even when the skies have cleared and the silence has settled, the planet's elements still carry a trace of what was lost. And how? Carbon, sulfur, oxygen, nitrogen. These are the storytellers now. Not in words, but in ratios. Not in shape, but in reaction. And the story they tell is one of regret. Slow, planetary, irreversible. A tale of systems out of balance, tipping toward damage, then correcting just a little too late. Because Earth doesn't think. It doesn't feel guilt. But its chemistry behaves like something trying to catch up with itself. Always behind. Always adjusting after the fact. A slow metabolism trying to erase its own fever. The signs are there, written into the cycles. Pulses of heat, then sudden chill. Spikes in carbon dioxide followed by long silences of drawdown. Methane flushed into the sky, then buried again in frozen soil. Each fluctuation a ripple of regret. These are not smooth transitions. They are jolts, crashes, overcorrections, moments when the planet reacted not with foresight but with instinct. We see it in the rock layers. One epoch ends in warming, the next begins in ice. Tropical forests replaced by ferns adapted to cold. Coral reefs lost, and then, slowly, reefs of a different kind take their place. It's not a reset. It's a reckoning, as if the chemistry of Earth is constantly trying to remember what stability feels like. And never quite getting there. And through it all, the elements keep moving. Carbon leaves the atmosphere and dissolves into oceans. Oceans turn acidic, so carbon settles into sediments. Volcanoes return it to the air. Then photosynthesis draws it back again. A great circular breath. But not a calm one. Not always. Because sometimes that breath stutters. Sometimes it gasps. Sometimes it forgets how to return to balance, and we see that forgetting in numbers, parts per million, per thousand, in layers of limestone and trapped air bubbles inside ancient ice. And the strangest part? Sometimes the planet's slow reactions make the consequences worse. A warming world melts permafrost, which releases methane, which causes more warming. An ocean short on oxygen slows the carbon pump, which raises greenhouse gases, which warms the ocean even more. And so the planet spirals, not into chaos exactly, but into memory loops, trying to undo what it already allowed, trying to cleanse a sky that's already thickened, trying to cool a surface already scorched. The chemistry does not panic. It does not plead. It simply reacts, late, always just behind the curve. And we can't help but see something of ourselves in that, can we? We too live in feedback loops. We ignore the signs. We delay the correction. We overdraw and then mourn the balance we once had. We live in a world of chemical regret. Not just in our machines but in our breath. In our agriculture. In our oceans of plastic. In the long half-lives of the things we leave behind. And when we look to the rock record for comfort, we find none. Only reminders that the planet has done this before, that life has teetered, that chemistry does not prevent collapse. It simply records it, with precision, with indifference, with perfect, aching patience. There's a beauty to it if you look closely, a sadness too, because Earth isn't broken, it's just reactive. And reaction, by its nature, is always a step behind. And so it pulses, heat, then cold. Excess, then silence, growth, then collapse. We read these pulses not just as data points, but as rhythms, the Earth's attempt to remember itself through imbalance. And perhaps this is why the chemical record feels so human. Because we, too, know what it means to realize something too late. To warm up after the fire is gone. To mourn after the damage is done. To feel the shape of something only in its absence. But unlike the Earth, we have awareness. We have foresight. We can read the isotopes and see the loops and feel the history in our bones. And the question becomes not whether the chemistry will continue to react, but whether we will. Whether we can act before the loops close. Before the imbalance becomes a rhythm we cannot unlearn. Because the world is not still. It is swinging. And each swing leaves behind a residue. A line in the rock. A shift in the sea, a moment of chemical regret, a fossilized, waiting to be found. But not all moments are fossilized. Some continue, deep beneath the silence, beneath the extinction, beneath the layers of stone we walk upon without thinking. Down there, where no light has ever reached, where pressures would crush most forms and temperatures shift like buried breath, something lives. Not loudly, not quickly, but it lives. We call it the deep biosphere, a vast, hidden network of microbial life that thrives within the Earth's crust. Not in oceans, not on land, but in the rock itself, in pores, in cracks, in the thin films of water between mineral grains. Life that doesn't grow in sunlight, but feeds on the slow alchemy of stone. It's hard to imagine. Life in the rock? But it's real. And it may be one of the most enduring systems the planet has ever known. Some estimates suggest that the mass of microbial life buried beneath Earth's surface rivals or even exceeds that of all life above. That for every tree, every bird, every human, there are countless cells living in silent persistence below, not evolving quickly, not changing much at all, just continuing. And perhaps that's the most remarkable thing, because while extinctions erased the surface, the deep biosphere hardly noticed. While oceans turned toxic and atmospheres thinned, the rock remained, warmed by the core, protected from radiation, fed by the slow release of hydrogen and sulfur from mineral reactions that haven't changed in billions of years. These microbes do not live the way we do. Some divide only once every 1,000 years. Some form spores and sleep for geological time spans. Some survive on almost nothing, a whisper of water, a trace of chemical energy. And yet they are alive. They repair themselves. They communicate in ways we barely understand. They persist not as passengers of the planet, but as part of its very body. And so we ask, could this hidden biosphere be Earth's quiet heartbeat? It doesn't pulse the way a heart does, but it breathes in its own way. It cycles carbon, nitrogen, methane. It transforms minerals. It alters porosity. It may even help regulate the planet's chemistry. Slowly, silently, steadily. A planetary hum beneath the noise of life and death. And in that hum, we hear something ancient. Because this isn't a new discovery. It's a very old truth finally seen. For most of Earth's history, surface life was minimal. The oceans were microbial, the continents barren. But the subsurface may have always been alive. When the surface froze, the biosphere below persisted. When impacts scorched the land, the crust cradled survivors. When oxygen came and went, when climates shifted, when light failed, the microbes in stone stayed. They are not ancestors of life. They are continuity itself. And perhaps, in a way, they are the keepers of memory, not in symbols but in survival. Not in stories but in structure. Because to live without change through everything is its own kind of message. Says, this is possible. Says, life does not need attention to matter. Says, survival is not always visible. And so we begin to wonder, if all visible life disappeared, if forests fell and oceans emptied, would the deep biosphere even notice? Would it simply continue? Would it wait? And if life ever began again, would it rise from this stone-sheltered seed? We don't know. But we do know this. Below the crises and collapses, beneath the extinction layers and the bones turned to vapor, beneath even the ghosts of vanished time, life has kept whispering. Quietly, patiently, faithfully. Not because it was trying to endure, but because it never stopped. And perhaps that's the real heartbeat of the planet. Not the seasons, not the wind, not even the tides, but the invisible persistence of cells, folded into stone, speaking a language older than sound. A language of survival without spectacle, presence without proof. A whisper we're only just beginning to hear. But what if the whisper isn't in life at all? What if it comes from decay? Not collapse, not ruin, but the slow, steady undoing of arrangement, the soft loosening of structure into something simpler, something more spread out, something less orderly but more complete. Entropy. The word often makes us uneasy. We think of it as loss, as forgetting, as the thing that drags systems down, takes apart what was built, pulls life towards stillness. But entropy doesn't erase, transforms. And in its transformations, it keeps records, ones we sometimes overlook because they don't take the shape of growth. We're drawn to emergence, to complexity, to life that builds towards something. But maybe the deeper truths are revealed as things come apart. Maybe the drift toward disorder is a kind of honesty, not about what was meant, but about what happened. Because when something decays, it leaves behind a signature, a spread of parts, a trail of disassembly. Bones bleach, metals rust, mountains crumble. What once stood in clean design begins to blur, and in that blur is memory. Not narrative memory, not linear, but spatial memory, textural memory, the way ash settles after fire, the way rust stains a surface that was once smooth, the way fossilized wood carries the imprint of cells long gone, now filled with quartz and silence. It is in the breakdown that we begin to see the outlines of what was once whole. And perhaps that's what entropy really is, not destruction, but the process of turning form into trace. A kind of truth-keeping. Because growth, for all its beauty, often hides its origins. It moves forward. It replaces. It builds over. A forest regrows, and the fire that cleared it is forgotten. A reef blooms, and the extinction beneath it disappears from sight. Newness covers the old like skin, but entropy preserves it, by undoing it slowly, by unraveling it gently, by holding every part until it falls away on its own. And so we ask, does decay record more honestly than growth? Not more beautifully, not more joyfully, but more completely, because entropy doesn't choose. It doesn't favor one life form or structure or civilization over another. It affects everything eventually. It's the most democratic force in nature, the quiet equalizer. A meteor strikes, and entropy begins. A body dies, and entropy begins. A memory fades, and entropy begins. But even as things fall apart, they leave behind echoes. Debris, discoloration, chemical fingerprints, spatial arrangement, scars. The scatter tells a story. The disarray becomes a kind of archive. We see it in the layered collapse of coral reefs, where generations of growth and die-off form intricate rings of mineral and void. We see it in abandoned cities, where metal oxidizes and plastic weathers and glass is slowly devoured by sand. We see it in sediment, the gentle sorting of particles by size, by weight, by the motion of water long gone. In each case, entropy is not silent. It's speaking, softly, deliberately, and if we learn to read its language, we begin to understand something profound. That what breaks down also reveals. That what unravels also remembers. That disorder isn't the loss of meaning, it's the rearrangement of it. Entropy does not forget. It lets go. And in the letting go, it shows us what mattered most, what held on the longest, what resisted change, what clung to the fabric of the world even as everything else dissolved. Maybe that's why we feel such tenderness toward ruins. Why we stare at the bones of animals long gone, the cracked edge of an eroded cliff, the dusted remnants of civilizations buried beneath cities. Because we know, instinctively, that these are truths we couldn't have seen when they were whole. There's no deception in a ruin, only what time leaves behind. And so, entropy becomes a memory machine, not through precision, but through accumulation. Not through order, but through pattern. Not through intention, but through inevitability. And this machine has always been running. Since the beginning. Since the first particle cooled, and began to drift and left behind its trace. The universe remembers not with clarity, but with residue. And Earth is no different. We are shaped by that memory. We are made of it. Our bodies carry elements formed in the heart of stars, scattered by explosions, gathered by chance. We are entropy briefly arranged into awareness. And one day we'll scatter again. And that's not tragedy. That's continuation. Because in our unraveling, we will leave behind a new pattern, a new trace, a new truth for the memory machine to carry. And so we wonder, gently, if entropy is the final writer of history, what kind of story are we leaving behind? Perhaps one where even water stopped moving, where the sky, heavy with memory, refused to weep, where gravity waited for rain that never came. There have been such days, not in our calendars, but in the deep chronology of the earth. Whole eras when the water cycle fractured, when evaporation outpaced return, when clouds formed but did not break, when drought was not a season but a system. No rivers carved the land. No storm rolled in to rinse the dust. Only stillness, only absence. And in that absence the world forgot how to flow. We trace these dry epochs in the bones of deserts, in fossilized dunes and salt-crusted basins. We see them in the isotopic record, in the ratios of oxygen atoms locked inside ancient minerals, in the absence of freshwater signals across entire regions. We see them in the emptiness of lake beds that never filled again. These were not localized droughts. These were planetary pauses. Moments when the hydrologic engine, the great cycle of evaporation, condensation, precipitation, runoff, stalled. Not permanently, but long enough to matter. Long enough to remake landscapes. Long enough to unwrite habitats. What causes such forgetting? Sometimes it begins with heat. Oceans warm. Evaporation increases. But the moisture doesn't rise high enough to condense. It hangs in the lower atmosphere like breath trapped in a room with no window. Sometimes it begins with volcanic aerosols which cool the surface but dry the air. Sometimes with continental drift, when landmasses shift into configurations that interrupt circulation, blocking winds, sealing off rainfall from the interior. And sometimes it's a feedback loop. Fewer plants means less transpiration. Less transpiration means fewer clouds. Fewer clouds, less rain. Less rain, fewer plants. The world shrinks into itself. The cycle closes in reverse. And gravity, that patient sculptor of rivers and canyons, waits beneath empty skies. In those dry times, erosion slows. Valleys no longer deepen. Mountains weather more slowly. The planet becomes a still painting of itself. A landscape without dialogue. Dust becomes the dominant force, lifted by wind, carried across continents, deposited in quiet layers. And yet, even in this dryness, traces of memory remain. In the crusted mud cracks that stretch across ancient playas. In the calcified root channels of vanished forests. In the ghosted outlines of lakes that once mirrored the stars. Absence once again becomes its own kind of record. We are shaped by water. Its rhythm is built into our biology. Into every breath, every cell, every cycle. To imagine a world without rain is to imagine a world where breath grows thin. Where soil turns to powder. Where time accumulates in dust, not flow. And yet, such worlds have existed. The late Permian, the mid-Devonian, even parts of the early Triassic. Epochs when life clung to the coastlines, and the interiors of continents turned skeletal. Vast interiors baked by sun and silence. And still some life held on. Cyanobacteria in rock crevices. Brine shrimp in hypersaline ponds. Lichens crusted on stone. Always the small things. Always the ones closest to stillness. They don't resist the drought. They become it, learning to breathe less, to wait longer, to grow in intervals no clock can measure. And when the rain returns, as it eventually does, they're ready. The land breaks open. The rivers run again. And gravity remembers. But the record of that stillness is never fully erased. Even in regions that are lush today, core samples pulled from beneath forest floors sometimes reveal layers of dust. Layers of drought. Layers from the day gravity forgot the rain. And so we wonder, what would it feel like to live in a world that no longer flows? A world where every puddle is a memory. Where every drop carries the weight of absence. Where weather is not a mood, but a silence. And if it happened before, if Earth paused its breath, lost its water song, turned away from motion, could it happen again? We don't ask out of fear. We ask because we are part of the cycle now. We are breath and cloud and soil. We are rain, rising from oceans we've forgotten how to touch. And when we listen for the planet's memory, sometimes we must ask not what it did, but what it stopped doing. Because stillness is not always peace. Sometimes it's waiting, but sometimes it's forgetting. And when the planet forgets how to move, how to rain, how to cycle breath from sea to sky, the forgetting doesn't stop at the ground. It reaches upward, into the air, into the atmosphere, into the light itself. And we are left to wonder, what hue is a dead sky? We're so used to associating the sky with color, with gradients of blue, with warm dusk, with violet shadows stitched between the clouds. Color feels like proof that the world is alive, that the atmosphere is working, that light is scattering the way it's meant to. But what if it isn't? What if the chemistry changes? What if the dust never settles, or the aerosols never leave? What if the air thickens or thins, or grows too toxic to carry brightness? Then, the color begins to drain, not like a switch, but like a memory slipping. We've seen it even in our own time, after great volcanic eruptions when the sky goes pale or strange or sickly. The sun turns copper. Twilight arrives too early. Shadows lose their edges. Even starlight dims. But those are temporary. What if the sky forgot for longer? What if entire epochs unfolded beneath a canopy of muted tones? Not blue, not gray, but something in between. A color without a name. A feeling more than a shade. This has happened before. In the aftermath of mass eruptions, when sulfur filled the stratosphere. In the tailwinds of asteroid impacts, when fine ash wrapped the planet in shadow. In the slow churn of methane-rich periods, when haze clung to the upper air and scattered light in strange, muted ways. Some models of the ancient Earth suggest skies that were not blue at all but orange, or white, or colorless. A faint diffusion of light through a dense, alien air. A sky without pigment. A sky without breath. A sky where photosynthesis falters. Where pigments don't evolve. Where eyes, if there were any, would see the world not as vivid, but as veiled. We don't think often about how much the atmosphere paints our lives. Color is not just in the objects we see, but in the light that touches them. A leaf is only green because the sky allows it to be. A sunrise is only pink because the air permits scattering. And when that permission is withdrawn, when scattering is interrupted or filtered or dulled, the palette fades. And with it, a sense of orientation, a sense of time, of season, of emotion, because color is more than wavelength. This memory, coded in perception. So what would it mean to live beneath a sky that forgets how to feel? Perhaps it would mean more than just dimness. Perhaps it would change behavior, migration, flowering, photosensitivity. Whole ecologies might flatten, slow, turn inward. And humans, if they were there, might speak in a different language of beauty. Or not at all. They might not look up. Or if they did, they might see only absence. It's strange to imagine a world where the sky is silent not in sound, but in light. But the rock record suggests such silence has existed. In pollen layers that vanish. In pigment traces that don't appear. In coral records that show prolonged dimming, followed by collapse. These are not just records of extinction. They are records of vision lost, of photosynthesis delayed, of skies that became places of forgetting. And perhaps, in some forgotten time, the planet wore a shroud for longer than we know. Not in mourning, but in recovery. Because after collapse, after heat, after soot, the atmosphere needs time. To clear, to dilute, to remember how to scatter light again. And so we wonder, if we had been there, what would we have seen? A sun without outline? A horizon without tone? Would we have recognized it as sky at all? Or would we have called it something else, not weather but weight, not season, but silence? And what would it feel like, in that silence, to witness the first return of color? The first hint of blue, faint and barely there. The first warm note of gold on a broken landscape. The sky exhaling not breath, but pigment. A reminder that memory can return, even after forgetting. But until then, the colorless sky lingers in the imagination. A quiet canopy, a lightless dome, a place where history was paused in midair, and where the planet, looking up at its own shadow, whispered softly, "I will remember how to glow." And when the light returned, it fell again on stone, on surfaces carved not by hands, but by accident. Because memory on Earth is not always intentional. Sometimes it survives because of luck. Sometimes it's pressed into permanence by a fluke of chemistry or a coincidence of pressure. Sometimes the best preserved stories are the ones that were never supposed to last. We think of fossils as deliberate things, as if the Earth chose what to keep. Skeletons perfectly laid out in ancient beds. Leaves printed with all their veins intact. Even soft-bodied creatures, captured mid-movement, preserved in breathtaking clarity. But preservation is not fairness. It is not balanced. It is not planned. It is chance. A mudslide that covered a body before it rotted. A lack of oxygen that stopped bacteria from completing their work. A mineral-rich spring that seeped through bone. replacing it cell by cell before it disappeared. It only takes one moment to fossilize a story that was meant to vanish, and one missing condition to erase 1,000 others. So we ask, what are we seeing when we look at the fossil record? Truth or coincidence? What if the clearest fossils, the ones we hold in museums, the ones we sketch into textbooks, were the accidents? What if the creatures that really define their age, the ones that built ecosystems, that shaped entire biomes, left no trace at all? What if the fossil that stuns us, the feathered dinosaur, the folded trilobite, the perfectly coiled ammonite, is the one that shouldn't have survived? An anomaly, a mistake in time sorting. And if so, what does that say about how we understand the past? Because the fossil record is not a full archive. It is a whisper of moments that intersected just right: death, burial, mineralization, discovery. Most things that lived never entered this sequence. They decomposed. They dissolved. They were eaten, scattered, burned. They passed through the world without leaving behind a skeleton in stone. And yet, one fish did. One fern frond did. One soft jelly thing, from over 500 million years ago, fell into the right kind of mud, in the right kind of bay, and settled into silence before decay could touch it. And now it lives in a drawer, in a museum, its body outlined in iron oxide like a breath held in stone. Not because it was important, but because the earth blinked, and it happened to fall. That's the strange poetry of it. That some of the most intimate glimpses we have of ancient life were never meant for us. They are accidents we turned into artifacts, flukes we mistook for stories. And yet, aren't they stories anyway? Even if the preservation was chance? Even if the creature was common or small or biologically unremarkable? Because what the fossil tells us, more than anything, is that it was here. It existed. It moved. It was part of the world. And somehow it escaped forgetting. Even just once. Even just this time. We tend to think of survival as an act of strength. But sometimes it's just proximity to silt. Just lying in the right place at the wrong time. Just being still when the mud came. That's how history gets written in stone. And so we are left with a strange thought. What if the story we know of Earth, its epochs, its creatures, its rhythms, is based not on intention, but on these preserved accidents? What if we are building our understanding of life from the lives that weren't meant to be remembered? Does that make the story less true? Or just more fragile? More poetic? Because there's something beautiful in knowing that memory doesn't always follow design. That sometimes the quietest forms are the ones that slip through extinction's filter. That sometimes the fossil that wasn't meant to be is the only one left to speak. And when we listen closely, to the fossils, to the sediments, to the isotopes arranged like syllables in stone, we begin to hear something more than silence. We begin to hear rhythm. Because extinction does not arrive like lightning, once and then never again. Comes in pulses. Comes in patterns. Comes in loops. A warming. Collapse. A breath held too long. And then, somehow, life returns. Only to face it again. The fossil record, that layered voice of time, whispers of at least 5 major mass extinctions. Not just scattered loss, but global undoing. Whole ecosystems swept away. Dominant species vanishing. Coral reefs crumbling. Forests thinning. Oceans suffocating. Each event different. Each event similar. The Ordovician, the Devonian, the Permian, the Triassic, the Cretaceous. Cold. Heat. Impact. Gas. Time. And yet, the result is always the same. A narrowing of possibility. A pause in biodiversity. A rewriting of life's path. And between them, smaller pulses. Less dramatic, but still visible in the rocks. Warming events. Anoxic oceans. Sudden die-offs. It is as if time itself cannot help but rehearse the same mistake. And so we wonder, does time forget or repeat? Does the planet learn or does it loop? We often picture time as linear, always moving forward, always evolving. But Earth's memory suggests a more circular shape. A spiral. A coil. One that passes through familiar places, dressed in slightly new form. Carbon rises. Oceans acidify. Oxygen drops. Species vanish. Carbon drops. Oceans heal. Oxygen rises. Species bloom. And then it begins again. Not on purpose. Not from intention. But because the system is vast and reactive and vulnerable to its own feedbacks. Sometimes a tipping point is triggered by volcanoes. Sometimes by orbital shifts. Sometimes perhaps by us. But the shape remains. A mistake repeated. And the memory of that repetition is carved into the very layers of Earth. Thin bands of clay, rich in iridium. Dark shales, full of organic carbon, laid down in anoxic seas. Isotope shifts like fingerprints, marking pulses of warming and collapse. They don't just tell us what happened. They tell us it happened again, and again, and again. Is that forgetting? Or is it just the rhythm of a system too large to stop? A planet breathing, swelling, choking, recovering, only to forget the lesson in the next long exhale. Entropy feeds this rhythm. So does geology. So does chance. But so does life. Because life, too, repeats itself. It explores the same solutions again and again. The eye, the wing, the spine, each reinvented across ages and species. Why would time be any different? Why wouldn't it spiral? And what does that mean for us? Are we inside a loop, repeating the conditions that ended others before us? We see the signs. Carbon rising, ice melting, oceans warming, extinctions accelerating. We tell ourselves it's different now. And in some ways it is. This time the trigger isn't volcanic. It isn't orbital. It's us. But the pattern is familiar. And maybe that's what unnerves us most. Not the novelty, but the recognition. The feeling that we've been here before, not personally but as a planet, as a system. And we remember not with certainty, but with echo. Because the rocks have seen this before. And they know how the story unfolds. Not always in catastrophe, but in silence, in delay, in tipping points reached and only recognized after they're crossed. Time doesn't announce its repetitions. It folds them into the layers, and waits for someone to notice. We are noticing now. We see the resemblance between past and present. We read the rhythms of extinction like the return of a forgotten song. And still, the question lingers. Is this just what Earth does? Or is this a mistake we can interrupt? Because if time repeats without memory, it cannot stop itself. But we can remember. We can recognize the shape. We can name the spiral. We can hear the refrain and choose to change the verse. That may be our difference. Not intelligence. Not technology. But memory held in common, spoken aloud. And if time is rehearsing the same mistake, then maybe we're the first ones to notice the script. Maybe we are not trapped inside the loop. Maybe we are the loop, remembering itself. But what if the memory came before us? What if it lives in the minerals, in the structure of stone, in the slow choreography of matter assembling itself without mind, and yet with meaning? We think of thought as something soft, neural, animal, bound by flesh. But beneath us, far below the coils of brain and bone, there is another architecture. One not alive in the way we know it, but responsive, reactive, capable of complexity. We call it clay. Not just soil, not just mud, but fine-grained minerals with crystalline structures, layered sheets of silicates that shift, that swell, that hold water, that trap ions, that react with organics. Clay does not think, but it organizes. It does not breathe, but it moves. In slow, silent ways, clay rearranges itself, exchanging elements, absorbing molecules, expanding with moisture, tightening with dryness. It stores. It remembers. It changes shape depending on what it encounters. Could this be a kind of precognition? A way for the Earth to process experience, not with intention, but with reaction. Some scientists have wondered. They study how clay surfaces can catalyze chemical reactions, how certain clays might have helped assemble the first organic molecules, even the first strands of RNA, the language of life. Clay, in this view, is not just dirt. It is template, a matrix for memory before memory had language, a scaffold where randomness begins to shape itself. Imagine a pool of water on the early Earth, rich in minerals, heat, and time. Within it, clay particles suspended, layered, shifting. Organic compounds drift in. Some stick, some align, some react. Nothing plans this, but still it happens. And in those reactions, quiet, non-living, slow, comes the first hint of pattern. Not life, but something approaching it. And maybe something listening, because clay responds to its environment. It stores electric charge. It forms ordered layers. It replicates not biologically but structurally. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps thinking doesn't begin with neurons. Perhaps it begins with minerals, with matter that arranges itself in response to change. What if consciousness didn't arrive with us? What if we are just the most recent expression of a planet already deep in its own slow thought? A thought that happens over centuries, not seconds, that moves through silicate and pressure and heat, that stores in lattice what we store in mind. The consciousness of clay would not speak. It would not desire, but it might feel in its own way the presence of change. A drought, a flood, a fire, a touch. And it might shift in response, imperceptibly to us, but unmistakable across deep time. We see clay as passive, but it has agency. It transforms water. It binds to metal. It swells, splits, carries charge. And it persists, more stable than bone, more reactive than stone, more ancient than civilization. What if it has been remembering longer than we've been forgetting? This idea is not metaphor. It is speculation grounded in chemistry. And speculation is where memory often begins. Could a mineral become aware? Not in the way we are, but aware of difference, a pattern, of rhythm. And if so, is the planet, through its clays and crystals, experiencing itself? Not as thought, not as vision, but as structure, as resonance, as a quiet, molecular echo that never quite stops rearranging. It's possible that long before neurons fired, before DNA spiraled, before life claimed consciousness as its own, the Earth was already responding, already collecting, already layering experience into its minerals, like pages pressed between stone. Clay may be the first attempt at memory, not perfect, not alive, but repeatable, mutable, persistent. We don't have to call it thought, but we might call it sensation. And in that sensation, perhaps something like awareness once stirred, the Earth not thinking but noticing, not remembering but retaining. And we, much later, are only the most recent voice in that long mineral conversation. Born from the same materials, coated with the same elements, holding, deep in our blood and breath, echoes of the same silicates that line ancient seabeds and form mountain hearts. We are not separate from the clay. We are its continuation, a thought that stood up and asked, "What am I?" And the ground beneath our feet may already know. Feel solid. Feel still. The hills do not tremble. The trees do not slide. The sky keeps its shape. Day follows day in familiar rhythm, and we trust, almost without question, that the world beneath us will hold. But the steadiness we feel is not truth. It is surface. It is illusion. Beneath our feet, the Earth is always moving. Plates drift. Heat pulses. Pressure builds. Ice flows. The very crust we call home is no more stable than a ship sailing on slow, invisible currents. Tectonic plates shift just centimeters each year. But over time, those centimeters become oceans, become mountains, become rifts and faults and folds. The continents we know were not always here. They are arrangements in motion, temporary formations pretending permanence. And even when they pause, they do not sleep. Stress accumulates, boundaries strain, then suddenly a quake, a release that reminds us, the Earth was never still. Even silence is only rest between motions. We think of landscapes as ancient. We call them timeless. But time does not grant stillness. It guarantees change. The coastlines shift. The deserts migrate. The glaciers advance, then melt, then come again. This is not chaos. It is order moving too slowly for us to see. But it's moving. Always. Even the climate, which we imagine as seasonal, cyclical, dependable, has never been fixed. Across deep time, Earth has swung between ice and fire, between greenhouse and snowball, between rainforests at the poles and glaciers at the equator. These transitions did not come from outside. They emerged from within, from feedback loops, from the tilt of the planet, from the breath of volcanoes, from the deep machinery of oceans and skies. The idea of a steady world is a story we tell ourselves for comfort. But the rocks tell another. They show us coral reefs in the middle of deserts. They show us sea creatures embedded in mountaintops. They show us forests buried in ash, jungles swallowed by ice, rivers rerouted by continents that once drifted across open sea. Nothing has stayed where it began. Not the air, not the water, not even the crust. And still we live as though it might. As though the mountains we see are eternal. As though the weather we know will always return to familiar patterns. As though the ice, once melted, will never come again. But the record says otherwise. It says the poles were once warm. It says the tropics once froze. It says the forests once stretched further. It says the deserts have moved. And it says all of this will happen again. Because the earth is not locked in place. It is in conversation with itself, the mantle speaking to the ocean whispering to the sky pressing back into the soil. This conversation is slow, but it never ends. Even the most stable places are not exempt. The heart of a continent, far from fault lines or coastlines, will one day crack. A glacier at rest for 10,000 years will begin to slide. A plane that hasn't changed in 1,000,000 years will rise, wrinkle, fall again. And so we walk each day across a map we mistake for fixed. But nothing is fixed. We are guests on a shifting stage, built from plates that drift and bend, beneath a sky that swells and contracts with breath we cannot feel. The illusion of stability is not foolish. It is necessary. It lets us live. But the planet is not fooled. The planet keeps moving. And we, even when we don't see it, are moving with it. But sometimes the movement stops. Not all at once. Not with a crash. But with a fading. With silence. With space that opens not from birth, but from loss. Mass extinction is often painted as catastrophe. And it is. It is the thinning of diversity. The failure of complexity. The disappearance of whole ecosystems, not gradually but suddenly. And yet, if we zoom out, if we view it not from the surface but from the slow spiral of deep time, it begins to look less like an ending, and more like a pause. A breath held. A stage cleared. A reset in the rhythm of life. Because after every major extinction, something else arrives. Something unexpected. Something that couldn't have found its place in the crowd. It's strange to say this, but extinction has created opportunity, not by kindness but by vacancy. It's an opening born from absence. When the dominant species vanish, when the old ecosystems fall silent, what's left is possibility. Niches unoccupied, resources untaken, air, water, space all waiting. And evolution, that tireless shaper of form, begins again. Not from scratch, but from fragments, from survivors, from the few that endured. And what rises is never quite like what came before. After the Ordovician extinction, new reefs. After the Devonian, forests. After the Permian, the age of reptiles. After the Cretaceous, mammals, small, nocturnal, overlooked, becoming dominant simply because the giants were gone. Could it be that sterility itself, the near-empty earth, was not only tragedy but transformation? Could it be that death, in sufficient scale, doesn't erase the story? It turns the page? We don't mean this romantically. We don't mean that extinction is good, or fair, or needed. We mean only that it changes the rules. It frees the margins. It alters the constraints. And in doing so, it allows evolution to explore new directions it never would have tried before. Because evolution is reactive. It doesn't plan. It works with what's there. And when what's there is only a few species, scattered and stunned, the story changes. What survives isn't always what's strongest. It's what's lucky, what's hidden, what's simple, what's flexible. And from that narrow foundation, everything new grows. Takes time. The gaps don't fill quickly. After the Permian extinction, the worst in Earth's history, recovery took millions of years. For a long while, the planet was quiet, empty, strange. The fossil record goes thin. The complexity collapses. It's as if life itself needed time to remember how to begin again. But it did. It always did. In every extinction's shadow, there was regrowth. Not because of hope, but because of chemistry, because of persistence, because of life's deep unwillingness to vanish completely. And so we wonder, is extinction part of the design? Not in purpose, but in function. Not as cruelty, but as reset. Like fire in a forest, clearing space for seedlings. Like winter, pausing growth so spring can reorganize the bloom. And if that's true, then what is the pause asking of us? Are we meant to respond? To step carefully into the cleared field? To build something new from what was left behind? Or are we only witnesses? Animals caught in the tide, never quite sure when the wave is rising or retreating. It's easy to think of evolution as a ladder, but it's not. It's a web, a spiral, a drift. Extinction prunes the branches, but sometimes in that pruning, light reaches places it never touched before. Sometimes the smallest life, the overlooked microbe, the shy burrower, the deep-sea drifter, becomes the starting point for something large, visible, enduring. That's what happened with us. We were not inevitable. We were opportunity stumbled into. A new form arising after the pause. A voice emerging into the quiet. And now, we face the possibility of another pause. One not caused by volcanoes or asteroids or methane plumes, but by us. A sixth extinction, unfolding not in silence, but in awareness. We know, we see, we document, we count the species gone, and still it grows. And so we ask again, is sterility a strange kind of opportunity? Maybe, but not the kind we should choose, not the kind we should trust, because this time the silence is one we created, and the pause may not be kind to us. Still, even now, life waits in the margins, in moss, in spores, in seeds hidden deep, in whispers of resilience too quiet to notice. And maybe if the pause comes, they will remember, they will begin again, and Earth, blank, breathless, paused, will not be empty. It will simply be waiting. And one day, not announced, not dramatic, something will shift. Not a revolution, not a roar, just a greenness so small it barely breaks the soil. A single leaf, not in defiance, but in memory, because even after all that vanished, something remembered how to unfold. We imagine it, this first leaf born not into a flourishing world, but into one freshly quiet. The air still thin, the soil still hesitant, the skies not yet returned to blue. And yet, it grows, not because it knows how, but because the pattern remains, because the machinery of life, photosynthesis, division, stretch, bloom, is deeper than ruin. It is older than extinction. It is patient. This leaf carries no agenda. It does not seek to reclaim. It does not ask what was lost. It opens because that is what leaves do. It drinks light. It exhales breath. And with that breath, Earth begins again. The planet has always moved this way, through pause and return, silence and song, collapse and then a murmur of growth. Sometimes the return begins in the sea, sometimes in spores, sometimes, as now, with a single stem piercing soft ash. Maybe no one saw this leaf. Maybe no eyes remained to witness it. But the wind noticed, the soil noticed, the memory of warmth in stone noticed. And that was enough, because life does not require audience. It only requires space. And stillness is not the absence of possibility, it is its waiting room. In this way, the leaf becomes more than a plant. It becomes a signal that entropy did not erase everything, that decay left room, that the planet's memory, though scorched and scrambled, still held a whisper of the blueprint. And with that whisper, form begins to return. Roots thread into place. Fungi creep toward new companions. Insects, ancient and small, awaken from their long dormancy. The earth does not rush. It never does. But it remembers. It remembers how to spiral a seed pod, how to beckon a bee, how to echo color through pigment and sky. Slowly, what was pause becomes process. What was aftermath becomes atmosphere. And the leaf, first alone, now one of many, dances lightly in a breeze that was once too toxic to stir. This is not resurrection. This is not perfection restored. This is something else. Something quieter. The wisdom of resilience. Of becoming again not as before but close enough. Because life never returns in replicas. It returns in rhythms, echoes, approximations that feel like memory wearing a new shape. The forests that regrow are not the same, but they hum with the same intention. Light, air, continuation. And somewhere under their shade, an animal will rest. It will not know the world was once nearly silent. It will not feel the weight of extinction in its chest. It will simply live, as all things do, inside the rhythm of the planet's next breath. And that, too, is part of the memory. Not the remembering of detail, but the continuation of pattern. The fact that the earth can be wounded and still flower, that the cycle can crack and still return, that after all the heat, all the silence, all the loss, a single leaf still grew, not to fix, not to forgive, but to witness the space that remained, to take root in the pause, to begin again. So now, as we lie here listening, eyes closed, thoughts adrift, we might picture that leaf, simple, unnoticed, completely enough, proof that even when the world unravels, the memory of how to grow is not lost. It is only waiting for stillness, and when the time is right, it will rise again, green, gentle, breathing,